Before we start today's interview, please allow me a word or two about our podcast. Even as Myanmar plunges into a civil war because of the military's bloody coup, the international community and media organizations have all but turned their backs on the country and its people. But this humble platform is committed to staying the course. We conduct nuanced, long-form interviews with a variety of guests connected to Myanmar so our listeners can better understand the ongoing crisis. Thank you for choosing to spend the next couple of hours with us today. For this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast, we're going to be talking to author Delphine Schrank. She wrote a book called Rebel of Rangoon, which came out some years ago. We're going to talk about the period of Myanmar history it covers, as well as where it leaves off and what that tells us about what we're seeing now. But most of the interview, we're going to be speaking about the time in which the book and the characters cover, which is a very rich study for understanding current events. So with that, the book's name is Rebel of Rangoon. And Delphine, thanks so much for taking the time to talk about your book.
Thank you so much for having me. Very honored to be here.
Yeah, it's great to chat with you. Before we go into some of the deeper meanings of the book and the characters and what develops, as well as what that means for what we're seeing now, let's just go and look at the book itself. For those listeners that haven't read it, we definitely encourage listeners either before or after the interview to read the book. But for those that are not familiar with the book itself, describe to the readers, or to the listeners, I should say, what your book covers and what the structure is.
Wow, I wrote it quite a while ago now. So it's a book that dives narratively into the lives of what I discovered as a reporter was a sort of semi-clandestine dissident pro-democracy movement built around Aung San Suu Kyi, who at the time was under house arrest. And it's a story that I had been told that there was no democracy movement when I was first sent to Burma for the Washington Post to cover a massive cyclone that landed in the Irrawaddy Delta and killed about 140,000 people. And I discovered otherwise. And so this book felt to me like a necessity as I started to discover a very interesting and very widespread and very deep movement of dissidents beyond Aung San Suu Kyi. And it tells the story almost novelistically, I hope, from the point of view of two characters, but really three, but lots of other characters in between. And those two are real people. One I call Nway, because he asked me to keep his real name off, a sort of strategist who at the time was a young man who would steal to Aung San Suu Kyi in the night when she was under house arrest. His friend and rival, who I call Nigel, they call themselves Nigel, his real name is Nai Lin. Both of them members of the NLD, of the youth NLD. And Win Tin, who at the time, when the book begins, he was in prison and then was released and became a leading figure of the National League for Democracy, Aung San Suu Kyi's party, and was thought of as the intellectual center in a way of the democracy movement. So the story sort of follows. It begins with a moment I witnessed when I first met Nway and Nigel, these two young men. Shortly after I met them, Nway had to go underground, even though he was already sort of living in a semi-clandestine way, because an agent chased him out of Rangoon, and I met him 2 weeks later when he was in hiding. And then Nigel, who I met with Nway initially, was detained and taken we knew not where, and held for 3 months and eventually released. And this is 2009. So it's a period when, as I said, Aung San Suu Kyi was under house arrest still. And there was talk of elections, and something was about to happen, and it wasn't at all clear. And to this underground dissident movement, they were very much trying to build and grow the idea of democracy after a very, very repressive period, right after the Saffron Revolution. This was a few months after when I first went, where people had been hunkered down and very much spooked by the crackdown. And yet there was still the existence of this organization. And but so it opens that way, and it follows the lives of these young men across 2, 3, 4 years through the elections of 2010, then the by-elections of 2012, which is when the NLD finally contested to join this slight opening that Myanmar had under a new constitution. And that was almost the beginning of a new phase when we thought Burma, Myanmar had begun to make this, as everyone was calling it, a sort of transition out of authoritarianism, in part because this very movement had made it into government and we're no longer just outside it. So it follows their trials and tribulations and tries to tell the deep story of why you're a dissident and what it meant to be a dissident during all of that time, what it meant to be living underground in the street with no place to go, afraid for your own family, and not being able to have a relationship, or falling in love and then having to leave it because you were afraid for your new love. And that's kind of the tale that I'm trying to tell, and what it really takes to stand up to a brutal, repressive regime that has spies possibly on every corner, while at the same time capturing a moment of Burmese history, as I was able to witness it, that I think had not been told, and to this day has not been told, other than in this little slice of what I could contribute.
Yeah, that's great. And I just want to underscore for listeners that might not be following the timeline of what you said, that you reference that when you came during Nargis, you inquired about the democracy movement and were told, presumably by, I don't know, diplomats or journalists or other Burma watchers, there is no democracy movement. This was 2009 when you were told this. And the transition started, depending on how you look at it, with the elections, 2010, 2012, certainly 2015, it was in full form. So just to underscore how fast and unexpected this change was into that no one saw coming, of what was taking place just a few years later. And serendipitously, you were starting to investigate and explore things underneath the ground before that massive surprising transformation happened. So you just had found yourself really at the right place and right time to pick to tell a story, when unbeknownst to you, most likely, and the actors you were talking about, because I haven't really spoken to anyone that expected this, change was just around the corner and coming in big ways. And so you're cataloging a period of that kind of oppressive lethargy, I might describe. And I was living there at the time as well, so as my own personal experience and seeing that change take place. And then when that change happened, you had cataloged a number of the details from ground level that gave a feeling or understanding or a rationale behind the change that took place. I'm wondering for you though, if you can describe your real aspiration or ambition in writing it. And I understand that in the process of writing, the decision to write, and then going and writing it, and then the release and publication, one's intention around that process can change during it, or it can be straightened or stay in the same focus. But in your case, how would you describe the aspiration or the ambition or the raison d'etre of why you were trying to write this, what you wanted it to be? And if that changed over the course of writing it, you can also share that.
It's, as you were asking me that question, I was picking off my shelf Albert Camus' The Rebel, which is part of the reason I have that word in my title, because so many things to answer. Practically speaking, I set out to write this book. Actually, the first time I went to, so Cyclone Nargis was in May 2008. And I was sent as a complete rookie from the Washington Post. At the time, journalists were getting kicked out if they were able to get in at all, because they were well known to Burmese authorities. I managed to get in. I have a French passport, well, an American one, and I got a visa, and I went in, and my editors deliberately told me, they said, steer clear of the political story. But in the 5 days, I had to scramble to figure out where Myanmar was on the map, and then actually figure out what's going on, and start to pronounce a few names to try to get to the catastrophe story. Yeah, I kept hearing from everyone who seemed to be the great Burma watchers and journalists who'd been there, oh, forget about the political story, doesn't exist, doesn't exist, doesn't exist. And the first thing I witnessed as a reporter was people. I landed in Rangoon. I noticed people organizing in Rangoon where there was supposedly no freedom of assembly or no right beyond 5 people to gather. And this was however many months after Saffron. So I immediately saw the contrary of what I was told. And I'm naturally quite contrarian, I think. Also, when I'm told something and I see something completely different, I want to follow it. My curiosity just kept me really engaged. And I met one person who called himself very much a sort of underground political activist. I was really meeting doctors and health workers and housekeepers and people in Rangoon who were just gathering together. But it seemed like a form of kind of civil society networking in a very unique and interesting way, in a way that I had not been led to understand a movement would come together. So that initially is what set me off. And then I decided on my own I wanted to go back and really go much deeper into the political story. So I went on to contact dissidents outside Burma, Myanmar, mainly on the Mysot, Mayawadi, where a lot of the organizations had then been placed so that they could help supposedly dissidents inside. And through a few of those people, they very kindly put me in touch with the young men who became the main characters in my book. And I was back in Rangoon, and then I was deep within a really overtly political movement. And I actually initially wrote one of those stories, the story of the young man getting chased out of Rangoon, of Nway. I initially wrote it as a piece for the Washington Post, and it was cut down to like 800 words. And like a lot of arrogant writers, I thought, it's not enough. There was so much more to tell. And something in me lit up, and I thought, I have to follow the life of this person. I thought I was seeing the twilight of a movement. And there was something so intriguing about being told by people who'd been studying Burma for years, it doesn't exist. And I was seeing, and I knew that the reason they were saying that is because they weren't on the ground talking to these people. They weren't seeing, and I thought there was something necessary. And to be honest, as I tried to track these people, and it wasn't easy, because remember there was very little technology at the time, or everyone was being monitored, and I wasn't in the country. I just felt a kind of obsessive need way beyond me to sort of follow the lives of these individuals. And I didn't really sit down to write this until like 3-4 years later. And it was just, I think the aspiration I had going in was the same one I had going out, even if the politics, then things became almost much more optimistic by the end, which was beautiful. I thought I was writing about the twilight of a real existing movement that I was told didn't exist. And I ended up seeing the kind of ray of light of this movement being so essential, I also believed, to the opening. And that was another thing that I felt was wrong in the narrative to this day, that it was all top down, led by the army. And my contention, my thesis, is that the very fact that these people were there and never went away, even if you tried to discard them into 90 different prisons and you can knock off as many heads as you want, they will keep coming. They will keep coming. And that was it. And then the reason I mentioned the rebel Albert Camus is because I had read him badly, I think, at one point, and I love Albert Camus. I love his own, acts of resistance during the French Revolution. The French resistance in the Second World War. But there's a line in The Rebel which is all about how it's just man's condition to rebel. Better to reign in hell than to be a subject of heaven, as Satan said. But somewhere in there he dismisses Asia, where it felt like he did. He dismisses the rest of the world, and I thought, no. And I kept hearing this as well, that like human rights and democracy and all of these ideas were sort of Western imports, which Aung San Suu Kyi and Amartya Sen and all of these people have written about deeply, is not at all that these absolutely can conform with Burmese values and not the Lee Kuan Yew vision. And I was hearing that then from the young people, and the dissidents were teaching me this too, that they were speaking in their own tradition, in their own language. And that's also why I wanted to call this the Rebel of Rangoon. I kind of wanted to respond to that in a very oblique way and say, hang on, This is not just a Western. And also why I write it kind of novelistic. I try to write from their point of view because I try to write in a culturally specific way to what makes sense to them, not to me.
Right. Yeah. And looking at the book that you ended up laying out and publishing, there have been various books over the years that cover some aspect of Burma for a foreign audience to better understand the society and history. I'm sure you're familiar with the main titles and authors. Most people that care about Burma have read all of the main list, the A list, and much of the B and C list as well. So where did you see like a gap or a missing piece in the way that Burma was being portrayed through the books you're reading at the time, and which you were slotting in as Rebel of Rangoon, perhaps trying to fill an existing gap in understanding or coverage?
Yeah, great question. There are some fantastic books, and there were some fantastic books written on Burma, Myanmar. Some that were really bestsellers, like Finding Orwell in Burma, but it
Hmm.
seemed more, with all due respect, its depth and it seemed kind of travelogue to me in the sense that
Hmm.
it was the footsteps. Others that were about Burma were all about Aung San Suu Kyi. You know, there a whole bookshelf on them, which again figure worthy of many biographies, but was not telling the full piece. And then there were other fantastic books on what it was like to live under repression. One by Anna Allott on Inked Out, and I mean I've got them all. I think I bought them all.
Hmm.
Everything by Bertel Lintner was amazing.
Yeah.
But the only books that I had really read that were looking and at what I was seeing was a couple of books by Bertel Lintner, one on, which were set around 1989,
Hmm.
when there was very evidently, very visibly, a huge popular power of the powerless movement. But then, of course, it kind of disappeared. And so I didn't find anything other than in the Irrawaddy and Mizima and some dissident publications that were doing an extraordinary job of tracking and chronicling their own people. There was nothing as a book that was showing what I think was so important to tell the world about this kind of viable political alternative that was not just about one protest that burned quickly out in the night
Hmm.
under a crackdown. And as a journalist, you know, a little bit later than when I began with Burma, suddenly the Arab Spring happened around, was it 2011? And again, the coverage was this kind of hyperbolic, almost hyperventilation about, oh, people are protesting in this square and that square, and statues being toppled. And but what I'd already begun to learn from my Burmese friends and sources was that they knew so well that was a beginning, but it wasn't enough, or it was part of a much deeper, much more sophisticated, subtle uh, endeavor to create, really a whole network of citizens who understood that one day, beyond protest, beyond toppling a statue, you have to put another government in place. You have to have a viable vision of tomorrow if you want to keep your movement nonviolent. That we're really pragmatically thinking about how are we going to get rid of this dictatorship? How long will it take? And what are our values? And what can we do to replace that? And so I simply hadn't seen that book, so I felt I had to be the one to write it.
Right. And I just want to underscore again for listeners, you were just describing how this generation of activists, young and old, were talking with each other about how to topple the dictatorship, what kind of federal democracy they wanted, et cetera, et cetera. This might kind of gloss over some listeners' ears because we've been hearing this for 2.5 years. This has been a hallmark of the resistance movement. But I want to underscore again, you're talking about 2008 and on. So you're talking about a network of people that are doing this, 15 years before now, building into what this is. And so I just really want to emphasize to our foreign listeners that are less familiar with Burma, how much this is emphasizing how long this small courageous group of people have been looking for the spark and looking for the societal change. And of course the starting date is not 2008 either, it goes before that as well. And so I think with that, it's a good time to look at the main characters in your book. And you do have two protagonists, although your book does wind around different historical events and other figures and go into different areas of history. So it doesn't just follow these two protagonists, but there are these two that you've already mentioned, Nigel and Nway. who you choose to focus on and their different personalities, their friendship, the kind of coming undoing somewhat of their friendship. And so I think it would be good for listeners to get a sense of who these two individuals are, those who haven't read the book, if you can describe something about their personalities and relationships and aspirations and who they were in the movement.
Sure. And first of all, thank you. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I'm a little bit inarticulate about talking about the Burmese democracy movement, unlike you, because it's been a while since I really followed it, and it's very granular. But the truth is, even I would have to say I'm very, very humble in appearing like 50 years into their struggle. Like, so I
Hmm.
begin with where I started, which was 2008, 2009. But the characters themselves, including the young man I'm about to get to, they
Hmm.
were very aware that they were 2, 3 generations into a
Right.
struggle. So Nway and Nigel, the two young men. The Rebel of Rangoon, the title character is really Nway,
Mhm.
even though I'm really writing about two young men. Because he struck me as exactly kind of almost my archetype of a rebel. He liked to
Mhm.
be very much in the shadows. He was very. I could see how strategic he was initially because he was always networking late at night, constant, just working nonstop. When he was sort of underground after he'd been chased out of Rangoon, he went for a while to hide in his hometown and then came back to Rangoon. And I sort of witnessed what that meant. It meant he would go to an internet cafe and sort of charm his way into being there like until 2 a.m. And then he'd just be out at tea shops and he would, but the whole time he was always working on helping people learn ideas that he himself had picked up through Aung San Suu Kyi and actually through a little brief stint at the American Center and to help them articulate um, their inner moral outrage. So he was this kind of like when I first met him, I found him quite cocky and confident and sort of knowing he was quite charming and quite sprite-like. I always think I thought of him as like a sort of Ariel in The Tempest or Puck in Midsummer Night's Dream. He has that kind of very agile, quick quality. Nigel was sort of the opposite. Now, Nway at the time, at one point, his real name will probably slip out. He was very much not a loner, but he had a best friend. But he was very clear that he wasn't going to have a girlfriend because it would get in the way of his work. Nigel was the opposite. He almost looked like a sort of Hollywood matinee idol and very young, sort of very masculine and sort of, but very sort of tranquil. When he spoke, it was he didn't speak that often, but when he spoke, you listened. They're both extremely articulate, but whereas
Mhm.
one is kind of like Mercury and Quicksilver and fire, the other is kind of more like Earth and a rooted tree. And Nigel, sure enough, would go on to sort of take the lead and be given leadership positions. Nway was offered it too, but he would always turn it down. Yes, they both came from political family. But
Mhm.
Nigel wanted nothing to do with politics because he'd seen how it had. In Nway's case, his father had died in prison. He was a doctor and he had died in prison as a political prisoner. In Nigel's case, his parents were also NLD members, very, very poor, but they'd been arrested and for a long time. And Nigel just was disgusted by politics. He saw that it didn't lead to anything. His family were dirt poor. But then the Saffron Revolution woke him up to politics and he found himself sort of giving an impromptu speech and seeing that he had this kind of natural charisma. And they both had a very different kind of charisma. And it was just really interesting to witness them because they both got on like chalk and cheese and they did a lot of stuff together. And they could really step on each other's nerves, but they were very, very different, but also amazingly complementary in their way.
Right. And tell us how you went about researching and writing this, because it's definitely unusual in terms of the scope and the style. Actually, as I started reading it, I initially was under the impression I was reading a work of fiction that was based on kind of composite characters that you had met and brought and put together into some kind of fictional telling that would mirror the reality of what you experienced. And then after reading it for some time, I realized that, oh, there might be some details change for the narrative purposes or for safety reasons, but generally speaking, these are all real characters in a real setting with everything real happening around them. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about both your process of researching, which, is you've said, was not safe for you and was very unsafe for them. And I can only imagine the conditions in pre-transition Burma that you were having to navigate to just even do the research of it, and then secondly, the writing style that you landed on to want to tell the story in.
Yeah. Yeah, been a while. Yes, when I first went, well, I should say, it's so easy to toot one's own horn. So it was so dangerous for me. But ultimately I'd be deported if I like the worst would happen to me. But I was always very very worried about the people I was talking to. When I first wrote about Burma for the Washington Post, I wrote in the byline, um, because when you go to these countries under repressive rule, you might think you're ticking all the right boxes. You're meeting people where they say to meet you, but you have no idea who's following you and what trail you've
Yeah.
left behind and how people are going to
Hmm.
get in trouble. And I really wondered, as I started really digging into this dissident movement, do I have a right to tell this? Because in a way, I'm revealing stuff that presumably, should
Hmm.
be revealed to their government if they're ever going to read whatever. Um, and it was people there on the ground. That's the first doctor I met there who said to me, no, 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 no. Like, we can't tell this story ourselves. You have to tell it to us so that we know what's going on. And I heard this repeated. And then the second thing, and this isn't actually my process, but I think it's important to highlight. The second thing about thinking, oh my gosh, it's so dangerous for these people to tell their story. The very first, they were doing so many other things that, were very, very, very courageous. That in a way, like talking to me, who am
Hmm.
I to think, oh, the most courageous thing they're doing is talking to me? On the contrary,
Hmm.
the very nature of their lives was putting them in danger of torture in prison. And I'm not using torture in prison lightly. This has been ridiculously well chronicled, as you know, far better than me, Ja. That there would be routine torture and routine disappearing for years and years in jail, for the kind of work that they were doing. So to my process. So when I first went in, yeah, I thought I was just going for one trip to get one story on how farmers had been devastated by a cyclone, to somehow get down from Rangoon to this place that was locked off by military checkpoints, and no journalists were allowed. I was like one of maybe 3 foreigners who were in the country. So I stood out like a sore thumb. So I had immediately to seem like I was kind of a very curious tourist and kind of ping pong my way around. But I quickly learned you can't, in a country like that, unless you're talking to political prisoners, ask about politics. Is people will shut up like clams, or else they might be a government agent. You can't say, oh, what do you think of your government? But I immediately saw, that you could, if I started a conversation with virtually everyone, your country is so beautiful but so poor, or something to that effect,
Yeah.
then people would immediately launch into, yes, but my government did this and this,
Yeah.
and then you
Yeah.
can start a conversation. But I would let them guide it and
Yeah.
keep it open. Now, that when it came to, so that was my first trip where people were not overtly political. And I was very careful to, sort of follow their lead and not tell people directly, oh, I'm working for the Washington Post, until I was in front of them in a quiet place and I could say to them directly, look, I'm a journalist. Are you okay talking to me? I won't use your name. But when it came to, I'm sorry again, I'm being so long-winded, but to talk to the political types, when I went back, I was living in Washington at the time. So I flew back to Washington. I wrote a bunch of stories, including one on political prisoners, because I'd met a few in that first trip. And then, because I really wanted to understand more about, the DNA of this dissident movement, I contacted some famous to the Burmese and diaspora community and Burma watchers, the heads of some organizations who were in Mysore, one of whom famously goes by DNA, and I'm sure he won't mind me saying that, Dr. Naam. And he very kindly put, and I asked them to put me in touch with people inside, which again was very, they just gave me emails and a couple of names. And then I went back in and I tried to contact these people. And I don't recall exactly how I did. I think very kindly the American Center let me meet with some young men and some young people in a quiet back room, as long as I didn't mention the American Center, places like that were a little bit safer, possibly. And then when I met Nway, he's the one that sort of organized. We met at a restaurant on a lake in Rangoon, which he chose, where there was no one. And around the table, he had gathered a group of other young dissidents, one of whom was Nigel. And 2 of the others, I think one ended up being a spy, according to them, and one ended up in a prison. But I was able to stay in touch with the 2 of them. And then Nway, as he was walking away from this fascinating 2-hour lunch, as I was asking him all kinds of questions, said, "Do you want to meet other people?" I said, "Absolutely." And so I met him later that night, And then shortly after that was when we'd been meeting several days while I was working on several other stories. I think I went up to Naypyidaw. Back then, Naypyidaw was just being constructed, and it was this, when I came back to Rangoon, I tried to contact him again. He was one of these lucky people who had a telephone at the time. This is pre-smartphone, everyone. This was when phones in Burma cost a fortune, and because SIM cards were all controlled by the government, like $500, which in a country that had like sub-Saharan levels of poverty, that's a lot of money. Anyway, and he didn't reply. Nway, the young man who had been kind of my guide into the dissident, he didn't reply after 2 weeks. And then I got contacted by someone who said he was a friend or a relative of Nway and said, no, he's been chased out of Rangoon and he kind of gave me the sense that Nway was in grave danger. And then somehow Nway and I met again on a dock in Rangoon. And I could see he'd been completely, this young man who'd been so cocky and confident and charming and open and quick 2 weeks before was so chastened, and so he was in a kind of disguise, and that began it. And he started to take me, and I walked with him as he was kind of trying to hide at nighttime in the dark streets of Rangoon until very, very late. And then I left the country. And then I just tried I think I lost touch with him for a while, him and Nigel, but somehow through an email, I managed to see them both. And then I kept going back for weeks at a time. And these 2 young men let me hang out with them as much as I possibly could, but always, and with all the other people I met, of course, I would just be very careful to sort of zigzag my way from a hotel. I'd never use the same driver. I'd walk a lot. And then I started to use a digital recorder, and this, I always use a digital recorder because I don't trust my own brain or even my own note-taking. And I just recorded hours of stuff. I would sit there with, while they're having tea till 3 a.m. and my recorder would be on. And then I just started putting that all together. Eventually, when, there was an arc that naturally was their lives, but also the background of what was going on in Burma. But I was always incredibly careful with anyone who was writing about this stuff. And as I'm sure yourself and the type of work you were doing, Joa, when I left the country, or even I have my own weird organization, which is to anyone else would be indecipherable. But here I was particularly careful to not, write names and addresses in full, and any recording I'd immediately upload, send off via, I think I'd go to I was in a hotel where there was the UN at one point. I'd go up and use their Sky or their VPN at the time, which I didn't have. So I do everything I possibly could to make sure that as I was going out of the country, everything I had was scrambled and tucked into socks and shoes, and so that the people I was leaving behind couldn't be, really tracked, or that I wouldn't be. And I didn't write with a byline long after journalists started writing with a byline coming in, because I didn't want these particular people who were at the heart of, enemy territory for the government, aside from the ethnic activists, to be tracked. And then eventually the country kind of opened up. It became a bit easier to follow them around. But I just was trying to be as much as I could be as a fly on the wall, and to be able then to write in this kind of narrative style. The books and the journalism that by then I had been very fortunate to join the Washington Post as an intern on the foreign desk as a copy editor. And to become a reporter reading the work of great narrative nonfiction writers within the Washington Post, and then in the books that they would write, people like Anthony Shadid or David Finkel or Anne Hull, and these incredible, like Catherine Boo. And I thought their work was such a beautiful way to tell these incredibly powerful geopolitical stories, but in a way that was so touching, so artistically moving. But also I knew how much work went into it, because I could see the kind of, in a way, it's the same work. You're doing the same thing, but instead of just interviewing someone cold, you're just witnessing their lives and writing this scene. And then it got to the point when I was sitting down to write that I started writing a chapter, and I realized I was kind of writing from inside the head of Nway and then of Win Tin. And when, I wasn't able to show to Win Tin when I was writing, but to Nway I could send him back bits, or at one point I could say, were you thinking this when this happened? Is that right? Was I right? And he's like, yes, how did you know? And it's obviously because I've been so kind of immersed in the kind of waters of what he had been navigating, and asking him the same question 80 times over 3 years or 4 years. and then following up and cross-verifying as much as I could, that I found I had the details to hand. I also was very careful that as much as I possibly could, as far as was possible, because at the time it wasn't even possible when I first went there to go to the NLD office. I'd be immediately labeled as a journalist and I had to go out. But I did eventually, I followed exactly where he said when he'd been chased down to Rangoon. I made sure I went everywhere, if possible, with them. Same with Nigel when he was detained. I couldn't go to the detention center he was in, but I made sure that I could witness as much of where they had been at a particular time, so that then I could describe it as and then of course there was a lot of stuff that had been written by a lot of other braver people than me who kind of had pioneered a lot of this stuff, and I relied a lot on their work. And I was just flicking through my book this morning, and luckily I do give them a lot of credit, I think, at the end, where I kind of give notes to sort of where a lot of my details emerge from, if they're not just directly from my interviews and observations.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned how Nway is really the main protagonist there, and you were telling the story much through his mind and experiences. And indeed, the structure of the book is giving parts of Myanmar history and introducing other characters through this ongoing story of a scary, horrendous evening where Nway realizes that he has a special branch tail on him, the military intelligence, and is trying to escape it. And so we keep getting a couple more hours into the night, and then it breaks down and we have a break into another snippet or another detail. But we followed Nway through the night as he's trying to escape this special branch. And actually, we've already referenced a few French authors and books, reference another one now, because that was what came to me. By the time we get to the end of Nway's experience on this one particular night, it made me think of the French author Louis Ferdinand Céline. I'm going to butcher the French, but Voyage au bout de la nuit. I think
Wow,
the English
yeah.
name is Journey to the End of the Night. And I don't know why it made me think of that. And certainly it's been so long since I read that, and I can't remember if that had anything to do with an oppressive state, or it was more existential and the deep night of the dark night of the soul. But something about the writing of that book and the feeling it gave off kind of reminded me of this kind of darker and later journey that Nway is taking to escape these followers. And you feel, I think it first starts out as something of it's somewhat funny, it's somewhat adventure, it's somewhat unexpected. And then as you get deeper into the night and he realizes his options for escape are more and more limited, it just starts to take on kind of a heavy, burdensome, unpleasant feel to the to his continual attempt to try to get away from them. And I think what draws that out is that you don't tell that all in one place, but you just give a couple hours every 50 pages or so. And so it's taking the reader step by step in a very slow way of, and eventually by the end, feeling as the adventure and the excitement wears off of the escape, feeling more the oppressive nature of what that is. So I wonder if you could also comment on that particular anecdote, that you really structure the book around how you tell.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. First of all, to compare me to Celine, I have to confess I haven't read Celine, but a book actually that I was struck by, because I was obviously looking for models of like how to write, because who am I? This is my first book. And Henri Malraux's La Condition Humaine, the Human Condition, it's about revolution in China, and it begins with this incredible scene of a young man who has to kill someone under a mosquito net. And it was so cinematic and so film noir, but also about such an important moment in that history. And that was really powerful to me. And yeah, so I had actually, when I sold the book, when you sell nonfiction, you sell the proposal first. And I'd written this massive proposal about these two boys, these two young men particularly. But a publisher came to me and said, look, why can't, people reading this from outside of Burma, Myanmar won't have a clue about the history. Can you just tell it more conventionally in a way? And I was totally or the other thing I also was hearing was that I should tell it from my point of view and talk about me, and there's absolutely nothing I wanted to do less than who cares. I wanted to disappear and tell their story. But that thing about telling it, like a history, I thought, well, that's been done. That's not what I'm trying to do. What I'm trying to do in a way is, yes, tell the story of this dissident movement, but much more deeply for me, it's an exploration of this sounds very pretentious, but it's true, of human nature. Like, what does it take to live this life, to dedicate yourself? Nway, and I failed to say this in the little biography where you invited me to talk about who he was. From what I understood, was quite a brilliant student, naturally very gifted, and he was going to go on and be a doctor. And he'd gotten into medical school, and he'd started, and he had a little run-in with military police, very young, and that's when he's like, and they sort of gave him an ultimatum: give up politics and keep on with your medical, studies. And he said, absolutely not. And he like threw up his hands and he said, that's it, I'm done. I'm going to be a dissident. He's never made money since. He's like lived destitute. He could have gone on to have a kind of comfortable professional life relative to what that's possible to have in a repressive regime. And so I really wanted to capture more than just the kind of cold, bare facts, which, to be honest, can be quite dull to people who aren't really into the history. I wanted to capture more the sensibility and the feel, and like, what does it take? What does it feel like to be in the soul, under the skin of these people? Because I was inspired by it, and I wanted to understand myself. Like, would I have what it takes to do what they did? Even though they'd be the first to say, what are you talking about? I'm not courageous. This is just what I'm going to do, And so the structure of that was it struck me that it was more interesting to tell it, in that style. Again, I'd not seen a single book on Burma about this. I'd not seen a book on a real dissident movement that was nonfiction told this way, from the point of view of dissidents, not just an essay like, Václav Havel's extraordinary work, but that really took you inside what it is like to be what they were doing, dissidents on the run, and yet continuing and pursuing.
So these aren't the only two characters you have. You also bring in a number of other personalities, all of them real, most of them a bit more well known than the two youths that you cover. And I think that's great because it also introduces us beyond the normal players. I think in many books that are covering some part of Burmese history, we hear about the same handful of people all over again. And these the people that you're describing don't usually get that kind of attention and nuance and character study. And so that is also in line with your aspiration for the book and bringing out, highlighting the nuances, more ground level grassroots view. So I thought we can just take a couple of minutes and go over some of the names that you introduce us to and learn more about who these people are and why they're important. The first one, I think, is the one you might devote the most attention to outside of these two characters, deservedly so, Win Tin. So can you tell us who Win Tin is?
Yeah, Win Tin was, I believe, a famous journalist even before he was thrown in jail after 1989, I think in 1990. I'm going to get the date. Forgive me for getting the dates wrong, but they're in the book correctly. I think. He was, when the National League for Democracy came together, it was, as Bartle Lintner once put it to me, I think it really was a league. It was not, people they were just united from all walks of life, from all classes, mainly Burmese, but ideally not. They were just united in wanting to throw out a military government and replace it with a democracy. And they coalesced around Aung San Suu Kyi as the daughter of Aung San. But there were many figures around her that she brought in and who had a hand in having an intellectual or an economic or maybe more of a military point of view. And Win Tin represented the sort of intellectual wing of the NLD insofar as he had been a great journalist and a great editor for many years. And his own life was a story of really, being on the ground and documenting the reality of what had happened to Burma and Myanmar as far as he could, even under censorship. And then after 1989, he was thrown in jail. I believe it's 19 years and 9 months. What's the exact date that he was there before he was released? And when I met him, he had been released, and he immediately went back to being this iconic intellectual figure. And by then, he was, what's his age? He was in his 80s or 79. And he knew he didn't have much time left. And he kept his prison blues on, his uniform from inside prison to point out to people, look, this is I was a prisoner for this many years. But it wasn't about him. And he knew that, like, holding court for various journalists at the time get him thrown back in jail because he wasn't Aung San Suu Kyi, didn't have that international cachet that she at least had to be under house arrest. He would be thrown back into prison and forgotten, which is not to say that Aung San Suu Kyi has had it easy either. That's not what I'm implying. But so he was this towering intellectual figure who also had quite a hard line when he came out, and he had very different and strong opinions against some of the other figures within the NLD, some other ideas about how they should approach going forward. He really wanted to reach out very early to the different ethnic groups around the periphery with whom the NLD had been basically cut off for years. And of course, he knew and understood how essential it would be for them all to unite together. But he couldn't communicate with them directly, so he'd do these creative things of using exile radio. And I didn't meet him that often, but a lot was being written about him. And I finally got to meet him. And I thought he was such a fascinating, yeah, I mean, he was beyond these two young men who no one ever heard of. Here was a figure who was well known within Burma. And another thing I set out to do with this and with using him as this, telling his story, which is so compelling in its own right, of his resilience and what he did in prison, was to show again that like this movement wasn't all about this one messiah-like figure who descended on Burma, Aung San Suu Kyi, and sort of told them, oh, this is we can have democracy. A lot of it came from them, and they coalesced. They needed it came from the bottom up, and he was one of those. He was one of these deeply, he just represented this cross-generational movement and a deep thinking movement in which a lot of people looked at other figures aside from Aung San Suu Kyi.
Great, thanks for that. Let's hear next about Nguyen.
Nguyen, he was a lawyer who I don't know if he's very well known these days. Aung San Suu Kyi has had several lawyers, some of whom have made it into the foreign press more than others. Nguyen was this very quiet. When I met him, he was one of her main lawyers who was representing Aung San Suu Kyi when she was put on trial for this ridiculous incident where an American had swum across the lake to her house, and the junta at the time had used it to keep her in house arrest for a lot longer. He was her lawyer, and he was then working inside, very, again, kind of under the radar, not someone who was out there showing his face, but was just a key behind the scenes interlocutor, and who did a lot of the work that you would just never have known about. It wasn't all Aung San Suu Kyi and like 2 or 3 secretaries. There were a lot of people behind the scenes. At one point, I think he was a campaign manager for them. And I was able, because he was also very close to the young men I was with, I just got to see their interactions, and I thought it was interesting to tell, a little bit of the world inside the NLD. There was a lot of criticism of it from the outside, but to see who are the operators inside, how are they keeping it alive from within the office, without the office, how are they communicating with Aung San Suu Kyi? What was the level of thinking within this operation?
Right. And I was looking up some of these names as I was reading to find out what were happening to them many years later, especially after the coup. I was sad to read that he was imprisoned after the coup and then died during the pandemic behind bars.
Yes, Nguyen died. He was quite advanced in age, but who knows what those conditions in prison. And I should say Nigel Nguyen had become the social minister for Yangon region, and he was swept up the night of the coup and has been disappeared, as I understand, in insane prison ever since. So,
And how about Nway? What can you tell us about what came of Nway?
Well, Nway held on. He had always kept a foot in the kind of underground, but so the minute the coup happened, he was a little bit outside. He'd been offered the chance by members of the NLD to become a legislator, like a lot of the other young people who are mentioned in the book. They did become legislators. He chose not to. He sort of kept alive an underground network. So the minute the coup happened, he kind of resurrected all this underground clandestine, keeping the cells small. And I stayed in touch with him as best I could. He was arrested at one point, but he had a fake name, and he managed to be released.
Wow.
I mean, he was on national TV. And then he was the last of a network of 50 people who finally fled the country. And this is a kid, he's not a kid anymore, who had stayed put through everything. And I asked him, how did he get out to a border area, I won't say where. And he's now working for the National Unity Government, helping. The last I spoke to him, he is helping get salaries to, he says, deserting soldiers. So he's keeping at it quietly. And the way he got out is because, he had friends with everyone. He's been very, very good at cultivating ties all over. He always understood the need
Mm.
to have alliances with the ethnic groups. And he had friends with members of the KNU, and I think they helped him get through. And they took him in a
Hmm.
car, and he got through. But eventually, yeah, it was devastating for him to, after all this time, all this sacrifice. It was just impossible for him to live anymore
Right.
in the country, and so he's working for the dissident movement from outside, and yeah.
Mm. And going down next on the list, Kin Maung Sui.
Kim Aung Shui. So he had also been one of Aung San Suu Kyi's founding executive council members, I think, and he had been an economist, if I'm a geologist.
Hmm.
And he, like Win Tin, was another of these many, many brilliant early figures of the NLD who basically spent up to 20 years or a bit more in prison. And again, we always hear Aung San Suu Kyi 21 years in prison and under house arrest. There were so many other of these figures that spent
Yeah.
21 years or 20 years dispersed, God knows where, getting tortured. He lost hearing in one of his right ears, I think it was right ear, one of his ears, from getting beaten. And when I met him, he was the most soft-spoken, dignified man, and
Hmm.
he loved Aung San Suu Kyi, was willing to put down his life for her. That seemed very evident. And he had a very nasty break with her, not from his end, but because he was considered a traitor by other members of the NLD. Because when the NLD at one point, was it 2010? Again, forgive my chronology. When there was this first election for the first time since 1990, the NLD refused to participate because there
Hmm.
were so many ridiculous rules, like no political prisoners could. He wanted the NLD to participate,
Hmm.
and because he thought it was better for the country, and he was ostracized for that. And he ended up going off to do his own party, and then he went on to have some things that were. I didn't hear him say this personally, but I read that he said some quite bigoted things about Muslims and Rohingya, I should say. So he became quite a figure of opprobrium in some sectors, but his efforts to he was one of these many young people that I met in Burma who were struggling in the dark to figure out what was best for the public interest, and he gave his utmost and was so clear in his convictions that the best thing for democracy was not to be, it was not so much being disloyal to Aung San Suu Kyi, the NLD, was just creating another party that went on to not win so many seats. So that's Kin Mao Shui.
Mm. And as with Yan Win, I Googled him as I was reading this and was amazed to read that he's on the SIC now. So he's with the military basically. And I thought that was
Oh,
really quite a
yeah,
stunning thing to read, that I'm reading about
yeah.
these two main characters, Yan Win and King Mao Shui, who are both supporting the democracy movement, NLD, Aung San Suu Kyi in different ways. And then as I read about what happens to them after the coup, one ends up in prison and dies there with the pandemic, and the other ends up on the SAC and supporting vocally in support of the military coup taking place. And
Wow.
so
Yeah.
this tells you something about their fortunes.
Yes, yes, yes. But it's so easy when you read from the outside to kind of make it seem it can often seem more black and white than it was. I mean,
Yeah.
that actually makes a lot of sense to me. The way that he was pushed out by the NLD, I felt very betrayed, even though I mean, I personally saw, and maybe I'm wrong, but I just read into him this kind of total heartbreak about how he hadn't been allowed to give his voice and to talk directly to Aung San Suu Kyi, and he tried very hard to kind of make his point of view known. And
Hmm.
one of the things that I was very true of the NLD back then is it was not known for allowing dissent for an organization, for a political party that was supposed to represent democracy. And of course, it
Hmm.
was heavily criticized for this. It was very hierarchical. It was very military in its way. It didn't allow. In fact, Nway was quite famous for making the youth movement break away because he was so fed up with taking orders, and he's
Hmm.
much more democratic and autocratic, and so is Nigel in his way. And so Kim Ma Shui, I know that it seemed very sincere that he thought the best interest of the country was to work with the government from early on, with a military government, because that would at least create the sort of thing you'd hear from him and others who were of that mold was, look, we've been talking secretly, like Nway, Nway's story, but we can run out of Rangoon, and then what? You have no power, you can't do anything, you can't talk to anyone. If we're in parliament, at least people will hear us. At least we're recorded. Better to be inside the tent than outside it to kick out the others. And And so, I don't know how he got from there to working directly with this new junta, but it would
Mm,
make sense to me that he'd been, that it might make it was the most natural way to have a voice. I don't want to compare it to what happened in the American government, the previous administration, but there's a lot
mhm.
of, this idea of like, is it better to work within an administration, a government that you might revile, but at least you can change it from the inside versus being on the outside and maybe having no voice, but having a nice ideological, hobby horse to stand on. But
Mm,
moral, as I heard from several people at the time, it's very easy to take the moral high ground until you've really lived this stuff. It's very
right.
easy to like be condemning, but when you're really there, what do
Yeah.
you do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it also breaks down just the real barriers between different sectors and shows the more fluid nature that can sometimes be confusing for us outsiders to understand. But that the fate of these two people definitely spoke to me in seeing the different directions that people can go and the categories that we think we hold up and yet they're transcended. Next on the list, if you could talk about Dr. Z. Hmm.
Dr. Z, Zoe Mount. I met him days after he'd been released again from like, what was it, 19 years in prison? I mean, something shocking. He was a doctor who joined in the 1988-1989 movement, quickly became one of the elected MPs that was never allowed to take his seat, and very soon after was thrown in jail. So another of these young or professionals at the time who just felt they were going to throw in their lot with the democracy movement and ended up spending their entire adult life in solitary confinement or thereabouts. And he was very close to Winton in prison, as I understood. Together they had a kind of prison revolution of sorts in in insane prison and what they managed to achieve. And when I met him, again, it was like a few days after, well, no, actually, he'd been released for a while, I think, but he was immediately back in politics, 20 years away, hadn't seen his kids grow up.
Hmm.
And I found him such another compelling figure who went on to then serve again for in Mandalay, or not in Mandalay, outside Mandalay, but he did go on to serve in Mandalay for the NLD. And I was often told from people outside again, like, what did the NLD know when they finally went into Parliament and government? None of them had ruled, and there was a kind of great political schooling that happened in university. I mean, in the prisons and in among politicians, they've been thinking about politics non-stop for years and gotten what they could to read about how to organize a society, about economics, about so I haven't. When was the last time I spoke? I think he's been in prison too since the coup because he was someone very senior
Uh-huh.
in the NLD now. I've only been able to talk to people over the phone or over Skype, so I haven't. But as far as I know, when I last looked at the Assistants Association of Political Prisoners, yeah, he was in prison too, and he had become someone very senior for the NLD. But again, someone whose just entire life was devoted to democracy for his country because he's
Hmm.
part of him outside of a very small circle. Um,
Mm. Another character you bring in is the wife of Nigel, who we're first introduced to just as his wife, as the kind of a supporting cast of a main character. This is Kin Sendar Win. But as we learn about her later in the book, she has her own democratic aspirations, and she ends up becoming a political figure in and of herself. So, describe who she is and what she's up to now, if you know.
yeah, Kind Underwin. I don't know what's happened to her because I have tried to find out what's going on with Nigel and Nina Lynn. Oh no, as I understand, she's well. Let's start with who she was. So she met Nigel as a young woman, and Burma now is still quite conservative towards women. They aren't really allowed to go out, and they're like, a lot of it talks a lot about men because they had a lot more facility getting out, gathering, having a beer at night. Women were not so much allowed to do that. She came from a very humble background, um, and she met and married Nigel after they both escaped after Saffron Revolution and spent some time together. But he'd had the opportunity to go to learn a bit of English and to hang out with other dissidents and to work in the NLD office. And she had not. And she'd gone on to have a child. And they were both dirt poor. And as a political figure, you were making no money. And Nigel was giving free English classes and free classes in the slums. And basically living off the goodwill of their own families and eating bits of rice. And she the same way. So she kind of had to lie low and let him take the front, take the lead. And in the 2012 by-elections, this was the first time the NLD joined And I think it was like with very, very few, just a handful of people were picked to run alongside Aung San Suu Kyi for parliament. Nigel was picked. She followed along as this kind of political wife. And then, yeah, eventually she too became a representative of the NLD locally. But she always had been, because she'd been a very dynamic figure in South. She'd been a young, just a citizen who protested and who'd been thrown in prison. And when Nigel was thrown into detention, incommunicado, no one had a clue where he was. He might have been in insane prison or somewhere else. She somehow figured out where he was. Again, this is a time with no cell phones, no, or if you talk on the phone, you can be sure someone's listening. Or so she found a way to track him. At the time she was heavily pregnant, and she managed to convince these prison guards to let her in, talk to her husband. And it was so counterintuitive when I heard that story, but also so true to someone who was, not a passive figure at all, as much a firebrand as Nigel was, and just had a different life as a woman, as a mother, but as much invested in the political story of her country as he was. What's happened to her now? I think he went on to be someone very senior in government, and she followed along with that. So their status went up. And I don't think she wasn't thrown in prison when he was, but she's had to care for their son and for the remnants of their family. And I don't really know where she is. I think she was trying to get out of the country last I heard.
Mm-hmm. Right. So that's great. It's great to have this background on some of these main and side characters. Now let's get to the central one. When it comes to reporting on Burma, I think that one of the things I'm most intrigued about is the character sketch that gets given of Aung San Suu Kyi. Most of the pre-2012 writings, if you want to put a year on it, they paint her in as a near saintly figure. And the stuff coming out after 2012 is equally as harsh on the other end of the scale. And yet both of these descriptions, character descriptions, are just kind of going for the easy pickings. This is a very complex person with a very deep family tree. And so I'm wondering, for listeners, if you can describe in your book, how would you describe the version of Aung San Suu Kyi we get? What kind of sketch do you make in portraying her?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think, again, this is also a reflection of, because a lot of the people writing about this that you're talking about are like Westerners. And there's a kind of condescension in the way she's depicted, again, and the whole society is depicted. And that frustrated me. Again, there's some Messiah-like figure who's a saint-like figure, and then suddenly she's not. And oh, guess what?
Yeah.
She's a human being, she's a politician who maybe made some horrible errors, but let's not, then demonize. I don't know. Anyway, but so the way I depicted her, she's been written about plenty. I was scheduled to have an interview with her when she was opening up to the whole world to have interviews, and then I couldn't get a visa to come back in. So I never actually met her in person. I would see her in the crowd when she was talking.
Right.
I really met her through all the other people that I'm describing in the book, and their opinion of her informed my sketch of her, and that's the way I tried to tell her. To the young men and women, or the young, the sort of children of the NLD, as it were, she was auntie. That's the way they referred to her. And Nway and his best friend, who left politics, who I'm still in touch with, and Nigel, to them she was auntie, but more than that, she was almost like a mother figure. She loved them. She took care of them. She had them under their wing, as I understand. So I tried to depict her through their eyes. And if there's one thing that, they certainly didn't have any, Nway told me this repeatedly. He's like, she's not a goddess. She's not a queen. She represents our democracy movement. Right now, we need to shut the hell up and be behind her. But, I know she's a pragmatic politician, and they knew that. But everyone spoke of her with a kind of deference, aside from very few outside the NLD who really had reason. They just really disliked her personally. I tried to tell her that way. And there were sort of certain incidents of the past that I didn't witness, when her car was stuck getting out of Rangoon, and famously, and Nway's best friend was with her at the time. And so I tried to tell her that way. And then, in the epilogue, which sort of covers a little bit of the beginning of the terrible atrocities committed against the Rohingya, which was, by the way, nothing new, but suddenly the world was seeing it. There was one of the characters who was very close to Nway, is a character in the book called Minus, who was Muslim, not Rohingya. And I tried to tell, his perspective and Nway's perspective. They were very disappointed with her too. They were starting to see her suddenly because she was in a different light. I try to tell her in that way too. So I'm not talking about her directly. I'm talking about her the way she's reflected through these characters, who, for the most part, venerated her, but in a way that was less um, idealized, I think, than a lot of us completely on the outside who made her out to be a saint.
You do have one criticism of her through the voice of Win Tin. What was Win Tin's concerns about her?
But Winton always stood up to her. I mean, that was one of the things that was very powerful about him, famously, is a lot of figures, particularly some of the other figures around her who had come from a military background, were supposedly much more deferent to her. Like Tinu is another character in the book. He had been a general and then deflected, moved to the NLD after 1989, and Aung Ji and a few of the other original figures of the NLD. And Winton was not like that. He spoke his mind. But as he would say, if I recall right, and Kim Shui too, in his way, and then he ended up breaking away from Aung San Suu Kyi. They when they spoke their mind, and they got back a very negative or a very sort of cold, no, I'm not going to listen to you. That, I think, that really shocked them, because they knew that they stood up for democracy, which is all about hearing multiple. He was very skeptical, and he stated that. Something along those lines, but he was repeatedly like contradicting her. Winton was, and like he wasn't afraid to, nothing to lose. That's what he did. He was a contrarian journalist who spoke his mind. It was all about speaking truth to power, which is what she supposedly was supposed to stand for, and that was very healthy. And I think in the later years, as I understood, following this further on, she kind of lost that. She had this like very tight circle around her, and a lot of the figures in this book who went on to like try to carry on this kind of democratic voice of the people, not about one figure, lost a lot of, they lost a lot of respect for someone who became a bit more authoritarian than she had been to them before.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the ironic questions that we're left with now is how democratic really is the National League for Democracy, the NLD, how democratic is Aung San Suu Kyi. And this has to be taken in the context from her own words herself, which, like so much about her, are really enigmatic and can be interpreted in many different ways. She famously said she does not want to be a democracy icon. She does not want to be seen that way. And I was just a bit ago, I was doing an interview with former U.S. Ambassador Scott Marcial. We were talking about
Oh yeah.
that quote. And in the middle of the interview, as we were talking about it, I suddenly had this insight where when I heard her say she didn't want to be seen as a democracy icon, I had always taken that a bit more, I guess, sympathetic or benign in my interpretation of it, and seeing, well, she wants to be pragmatic, and you can't be this perfect saintly person when you're trying to engage in the hard work of governing. And that was always how I took it. And suddenly, in the context of our conversation, I thought, well, another way to take that is not so much looking at the icon part, but looking at the democracy part, and saying that she doesn't want to be a democracy icon, meaning, and that starting to
Wow.
question how does she understand democracy? How democratic is she, and how
Wow.
democratic is the institution under her?
I think many of us assume that people, this is one thing I learned from Buddhism. I'm
Mm,
not Buddhist, but any meditator, one of the existential truths is that we're not as one self, as I understand that, like we can
mhm,
evolve. And I
mhm,
think you can read in her early writings, which I read religiously when I was reading that, like very pro-democratic ideas. She makes a wonderful defense of the ideas of democracy, but she's also always been very, like, one of the very, very first things she said in her famous speech at Shwedagon Pagoda, as I understand, was, I'm my father's daughter, or, like my
mhm,
father. She always respected the military, and she made
mhm.
that very clear from the start. And no one
She
was
did.
in any, yeah, while also being an extraordinary and very articulate defender of democracy. And anyone who criticizes her now, I invite you to go back and read her early writings. Whatever she went on to do, she was a very, very articulate exponent of
Mhm,
something that sounded very nice to Western ears,
mhm,
and obviously sincere in it at a certain point, when she was outside down. So the question is she, I think, yeah, there was certainly a sense. First of all, it was very hard to read who was she really when she was under house arrest, and it's one thing to
mm,
write an article, it's another to go. But and there was a lot of disappointment among people when the NLD got into power, and she appeared to have these more authoritarian tendencies and appeared to be listening to fewer people, and there was a lot of talk that she wasn't grooming a lot of up and comers. But I tell you, even without, you can, even if she's still in the picture, all the people that I'm writing about, and in fact lots of people we haven't mentioned, who I sort of mentioned in the later chapters, these young women, and they all went on to be quite powerful young local legislators, including the young woman who becomes Nway's girlfriend at the end, Nobel, who went on to be, and that's her fake name. Her parents gave her the fake name of Nobel because she was born the year that Aung San Suu Kyi won a Nobel, and the Nobel Peace Prize. And she went on to be an NLD representative for a little region in downtown Rangoon. And and I guess the point is that that there were a lot of and Nigel was going. There were all these figures that were actually doing an awful lot at the local level, and that were holding true. And I saw this with Nigel particularly when he was in government. I followed him a bit. And around the time of the Rohingya stuff, and I said, "What are you doing about it?" And he's like, "Well, meanwhile we've got to get papers to school, and we've got to get water, and we've got to get this, and we're doing that." And he told me 50 things he was doing in his particular constituency, which sounded like what you want of a young democracy leader who's being true to his democratic ideal. So I think in the focus on Aung San Suu Kyi, we're often asking, we're so focused on her, is she a democracy activist or not, that we forget that there were still these people around her who'd gone on to be politicians and legislators and who were legislating and who were, and another young woman who ended up representing Chinatown, she's called Popo in the book. When I went to visit her in Chinatown, she was literally picking, the 5 things that she told me she actually did. She did. She was putting CCTVs in place because people were talking about robbery. She was picking up the trash, doing all the things that are boring, mundane jobs of young legislators. While you're busy focusing on the pretty icon who's giving a speech or not or saying the wrong thing, you forget about the real. And Nigel was working within government trying to change the cultural mindset because they had to work with the junta. They all had issues with working with the military mindset people and the civil servants who worked with the military, and they were gently trying to change them into this much more. So that doesn't really answer your question, but I think I have to say that my focus was always more on well, hang on, I don't know, because I'm not, there are plenty of people who've interviewed her and are right, but I can tell you that the young people that were around her have gone on to continue doing the democracy work that they set out to do, in which she was a critical inspiration, but not the only thing there. I think take her away and there will be a democracy movement, and I think we're seeing it now.
Right. So you mentioned Nigel and the work he was doing. You also reference your how you were impacted by Buddhism and meditation. I want to focus on that for a moment. You have a section in the book that is referencing Nigel's Vipassana meditation practice, and I think that the role that meditation has played in the democracy movement in Burma over the years, and especially today, I do think it's quite underlooked and undervalued by a Western audience who sees Buddhist meditation as kind of a monolithic thing. And I think and that's one of the things this platform has tried to do, is to bring on a number of speakers from a number of perspectives and try to understand where meditation and different aspects of the Buddhist teachings and overall Burmese Buddhism, where that has fit into animating or motivating or providing balance or insights or wisdom or relaxation or whatever else, what role that has played in the democracy movement and in specific democracy activists. So I was really happy to see this part of Nigel's personality described. Beyond the pages, what did you learn about where meditation fit into the lives of democracy activists in general, and perhaps with Nigel more specifically?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that, and I couldn't agree with you more. And I find it's preemption before getting to the role that I think meditation really matters to the politicians of Burma, Myanmar. I find it so interesting. There are all these meditation apps, of which I listen to several, and a lot of the great meditators who brought meditation to the West and to America studied with great Burmese meditators, but they never make the connection with what's going on in Burma. Why should they? As in Washington has called the Burma, the situation in Myanmar like a boutique issue. But I found it immediately fascinating because in my first trip to Burma, I was meeting with a lot of political prisoners. I think I eventually met with, I clocked it at 45 or something. And ones who'd been in prison for years and years. And I found them all to be so serene. And I would repeatedly ask them, how did you, a lot of them lived in solitary confinement for years and were ready to go crazy. And they'd say that, but they all meditated for hours a day. And then I realized that everyone around me, not even those who would go to the pagoda and pray before the shrines and do all the sort of rituals of Buddhism, They had all learned from a very young age, including Nway, to like before they went to bed as a child, to just focus on their breath, going in, going out, going in, going out. And repeatedly, I remember very clearly when Nway was going to, I think it's chapter 8 in my book, where Nigel is running for Parliament and Nway is kind of his campaign manager. And he had to carry a speech. And he had something very important in his briefcase. And as we were going up, he was meditating quietly while talking to me, focusing on his breath. And I think it's critical to the way that the politicians and the dissident movement and sort of were able to detach themselves from some of the deeper animosities and hatreds. I'm going to compare it to the region of the world that I'm currently covering, which is completely different. I'm writing a book about Central America. I spend a lot of time in Honduras. I just returned from a trip to El Salvador. I live in Mexico. There's a lot of extraordinary intellectual ferment going on here, obviously, but they don't meditate. I wish people would here. I think it explains a lot of the. I think it gave a philosophical depth. And when Aung San Suu Kyi talked about mental freedom, she articulated it perhaps more than all the rest. Sort of when she was under house arrest and BBC journalists would periodically interview her, and she'd say, no, but I'm really free. And the Western would be like, oh, well, that's sweet, but she's not really free. But she meant it. And the Burmese understood what she meant by that. Because when you meditate, and I know that, Joe, you told me prior to this recording, you also meditate, you sort of realize that if you can sit with your own madness and your monkey mind and all the feelings you have, nothing else can really affect you because you've kind of gotten through, and you enter into all these understandings of what consciousness is, and so you are kind of free if you're able to modulate that. And I found it very interesting that Nigel, obviously, when he was in detention, did the same thing when he was very angry and there's nothing he could do and he felt impotent. And I've gone this whole however long I've just talked about this without mentioning the text that is the best on this, and I'm sure maybe you've interviewed him. Mental Culture in Burmese Crisis Politics, Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy by Gustav Hutman, which somehow I got a copy of before I read it. It's incredibly detailed. It's this deep anthropological look at how Buddhism, the sort of meditation part helped the democracy activists, and the kind of rituals and trappings and wanting to like gild a pagoda and earning merit helped the military effectively. And, the one that was much more mental and personal. Oh, the other thing I should mention that I think was very, I kept hearing, oh, there's a Buddhist country is very passive. No one's doing anything because they're so passive. They're so passive. They believe in the next life and reincarnation. And what I learned from Burmese Buddhism immediately was it's the contrary. The minute you're meditating, you learn to be, you develop these skills. You develop the skills of action. You do all the things that, the mono Judeo-Christian tradition as well, about taking agency and, taking action. And it's no different. And the dissidents used Buddhism and meditation as a way to strengthen their resolve and strengthen their ability to move forward through, frankly, incredibly difficult personal suffering that other people might sit back and feel themselves to be victims. Again, I'm sorry that was so incoherent, but there's a lot that I think, and I certainly try to include it in the book. And it's in very explicitly in the second chapter on Nigel when he's in detention, where he sits down to meditate. But Nway too, his sense of samsara and his sense of like just the impermanence of who they were, I think also affects them greatly, because they feel like, well, who am I? I'm just a fleck of dust and I'm changing anyway. So I might as well, my job is to give myself to this movement. They're less individualistic as well. They see themselves more easily, I think, within a broader struggle and a broader cause. And I think that philosophy helps them get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when you look at the exportation of Buddhist meditation, which then went into more secular mindfulness, it's removing one part of this holistic Burmese Buddhist experience and making a technique and a culture and a practice out of it that then goes abroad and transforms people's lives. But in that exported version, it becomes harder to know where this practice fits in and integrates with one's social engagement in wider society. And whereas in Burma, the act of meditating is, and this is something that as a meditator, when I went there, that just so amazed me and intrigued me from the start, is that the act of meditating was not something that brought me out of society and into my own personal pursuit, but it was something which actually in my case seemed to ingrain me and integrate me more in society. It seemed to connect me more to my surroundings and the overall culture and my actions and community and everything else. And so I think that's, and we've had numerous podcasts with Burmese guests who have explained where their meditation fits into their wider social mission and work towards democracy, as well as with foreign meditators. I'm thinking of someone like Alan Clements or especially Steve Smith,
Mm.
who
Mm.
reference on our platform coming to, but these are people who were coming in the 70s and 80s and referencing coming as, in their own words, a somewhat selfish Westerner who was just dedicated to the practice and the spiritual journey and the work towards nibbana, and through the Burmese masters they trained under, came to see how their narrow focus was limiting their development and practice, and seeing how it was integrated in their community and those around them. Of course, so this is not even referencing yet the role of the monastery, which doesn't really exist in the West. We're a secular meditation center which is offering limited and regularly scheduled courses that then practitioners after the course will practice uh, some hours of the day by themselves in daily life. That is just a completely different experience than the role that the Burmese monastery can play. And so I think that this is definitely something that on many levels is just not understand. This is really looking at it from the viewpoint of Western meditators. I think that Western meditators who have a deep understanding of the have studied Buddhism in some way, have practiced it, have dedicated their lives to it, so they understand this practice part, but don't necessarily get where it's linked with the wider societal stuff and the role of the monastery. But then when you're talking about like the non-meditator, aid workers, diplomats, journalists, authors, things like that, then there's even a deeper part that I think they're missing. I think then their view of what meditation is and what Buddhism is becomes even more deeply skewed of and where you get much more of these kind of generalized and less investigative and critically minded explorations of what exactly Buddhism or meditation is, and then it just becomes a piece that people are either uncomfortable with, or they define in very simple ways, or is just not given a full treatment. And so then with that, I think we as outsiders lose a very important and critical understanding of overall society and history and individuals and politics and democracy and everything else. I don't think you can leave that part out or not understand it to its full extent and then expect to understand everything around it, because in Myanmar everything there, these lines aren't there. It's not like you have a line between democracy and politics and then Buddhism, monasticism, and meditation on the other hand. All of these things are connected, and if you're not understanding one aspect or part of that connection, you're not understanding the overall entity. You can't just carve one off and say you're just going to look at one part of it, because you're not going to get a full picture of it.
I totally agree. I think it was so well put. I agree with you 1000%. And yeah, I approach my journalism a bit like anthropologists. That's like, I sort of began doing a bit of a Pasana meditation in a way to understand where they were coming from, because also Nway is not, he wouldn't call himself religious, but he meditates. They all learned to meditate, they used it. And I think you touched on so many things about the role of, how it invests you more in society. But I think, although a lot of mindfulness is the way it's been brought to the West, was in some sense sometimes filtered through, Harvard Business School. How can it make you a more efficient, productive, economic component of the, like national GDP and like do better. And there, of course, it has a completely different function. It has, on the one hand, a very therapeutic, personal, as we all know, effect, which it just does. So it naturally helps people who are living very difficult lives to sort of disengage and to sort of have a sense of perspective. But it also has that additional critical spiritual and societal function that you put your finger on there, and that I think I've been struggling to say, but I tried to get through in my book that yeah, I think it's I think and the role of the monastery, which is so essential in Burma, insofar as like every man will effectively go there for 2 weeks a year, and a lot of women will become nuns, and so it's a very democratic thing, which is why the role of the monks is so important. It's because everyone can be a monk, and everyone is for a moment, and but yes, and I think you're absolutely right. I think the Western gaze or outsiders gaze who don't quite get that often miss a critical part of why, for instance, why I have and always have had enormous hope in Myanmar versus other countries I've been to, because
Yeah.
there's a spiritual center. Another thing about that, I think, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. And I'm thinking as I say this, it's been a while, but that I think it removes a bit of the sort of materialist and of course there's a quest for power among a lot of natural human beings, but I think a lot of the reason that the characters I'm writing about are not well known to anyone outside of Aung San Suu Kyi, who spoke beautiful English and he was a beautiful, emblematic figure of all of this. They weren't interested in being famous and being being well
Mhm.
known. Some of them became very famous. A lot of the 1988 students, they became very well known within Burma. But and I think part of that is the Buddhism. They weren't interested in putting themselves forward as individuals. They were dedicated to something greater than them. And again, because of I think one of the deeper existential truths of Buddhism, which is you're not one ego, you're changing, and you're forgive me for vulgarizing
Mhm.
and phrasing it my own way, and I think so much of what you say is so true, and I think the Buddhism and the meditation is so much a part of this story. Even though, I think, obviously when we're talking about the Kachin and the Karen and, now their work with the NLD or the National Unity Government, there's a lot of Christianity in that. I think faith in and of itself, which ultimately you can read any of the ancient wisdom systems and a lot of them arrive at the same truths. And then there's a lot of commonality in people who, um, anywhere in the world, are driven by a deep faith, and they bring their politics along, and they're working for something, and they believe in something transcendent. I think it does affect
Sure.
the course of people's lives and the course of their political lives.
Sure. And this leads to the next question where we're looking at marrying some of this background with Buddhism and the principles and ethics behind Buddhism with Burmese culture, politics, and especially the NLD. One of the things that really stood out in your book is this enormous personal dedication that committing to the democracy movement in Myanmar entails. You describe families where one sibling has chosen to work for democracy with the understanding that he will be supported financially by all the others. I mean, this is almost like a monkhood. You go to become a monk and the family supports your spiritual journey. You go to become a democracy activist, same thing. At the same, just like the monkhood, you have to give something and sacrifice something in order to get something. And you describe a tension arising between Nway and Nigel because Nigel breaks this code by pursuing a romance and eventually marrying, and Nway feels a sense of betrayal and that activists should sacrifice any possibility of romance. This is just one anecdote of many that you could reference or I could reference that is showing the personal sacrifices of being involved in democracy and for one's country. And we had a past podcast with a governance specialist called Philip Anawit, and in when he was describing the shape of the NUG going back to the NLD days, he kept using this phrase. I don't know if he coined it or it was coming from somewhere else, but he kept using this phrase called the culture of sacrifice. That there's this culture of sacrifice in the democracy movement, and it blew me away. And we talked quite a bit offline where he was looking at it more from a governance perspective and the formation of a bureaucracy and a democracy movement, and I immediately read a lot of Buddhist ethics and values into that. He didn't have so much have the Philip doesn't so much have the Buddhist background, so we were having a very interesting conversation contrasting the culture of sacrifice as it relates to governance and democracy, and on the other hand, where it's coming from kind of a Buddhist mindset, where if you weren't familiar with the shape of Burmese Buddhism, how you can, in what ways this culture of sacrifice comes. And Philip was describing both the more beneficial parts of this culture of sacrifice, how the CDM, NUG, PDF, all of these things wouldn't be existing without this. I mean, you basically had this unprecedented experiment of thousands of volunteers who were working towards this democratic movement in some ways, and this was really wonderful. But then also the more, perhaps the parts of this culture of sacrifice with which don't become so effective, like the fact that you at the end of the day, eventually you have to turn a volunteer bureaucracy into something a bit more stable that follows certain kinds of standards and rules in order to succeed and transform into something else, as well as the fact that, and this is well documented by many, that there is something of a meritocracy, or sorry, there's a lack of meritocracy in the democratic movement, where one is often rewarded for how much they've already sacrificed. And you see that with like NUG appointments, that some of the people that were appointed to different ministries in NUG and have now been serving open-ended with really almost no transparency or accountability to speak of, were appointed to those positions not because they had any background whatsoever in whatever office they had, but for the number of years they'd spent in jail, or the torture they'd endured. And so there's just so many directions you can go with this culture of sacrifice. And then when you bring in the Buddhist element of it, the lack of ego and the kind of letting go of one's own needs and desires, whether, a monk obviously does that. A monk renounces much in the world, but even the depiction you paint of some of these democracy activists, they're renouncing some of the pleasures and really rights and privileges of a human being living in the world. They're renouncing those with a dedication for this higher aspiration of democracy and expecting others around them to renounce that as well. I mean, if that's not another example of culture of sacrifice, then what is? So in what ways, aside from how we've been talking, did you see this culture of sacrifice taking shape amongst those in the movement? And what were your thoughts about seeing the role it played in terms of those, as with Philip, and how I was talking with him, those parts of it where you're really seeing something special take off that is not existing in a lot of other countries, and that we all really stand back in admiration of, and those parts which are maybe not so effective, and how far the extreme can go.
The sacrifices that I was seeing were very tangible. You mentioned a few. So Nway, when his father died in prison when he was still a child, his mother, who had been a nurse, I say they're from Twante, which is a little town outside of Rangoon. They were country. Because his father was a country doctor, his mother was a nurse. His father had actually gone to school with Aung San Suu Kyi at one point, and he could have gone on to be like a city doctor, but chose to work in Nway grew up in a family of, in other words, a man who decided to be a rural doctor and dedicate himself to politics and dies in prison, and Ray would visit him in insane as much as he could as a child, and suffer on the way, and they were very, very poor. And then his father dies, and his mother calls the four boys together and says, "I want one of you to work for the lady." And it was Ray that stepped forward, and he wasn't the eldest, and he wanted to be a doctor like his dad, and his brothers sort of said that they would help him out. At times they haven't been able to for 1,000 reasons, including like the sheer logistics of trying to help someone who's on the ground, and for the danger that they then would face. He also he sacrificed having a medical career. He sacrificed having a girlfriend for years, until inevitably he's just human and he ended up falling in love with a girl in his own movement, and never married. And he might reproach me for saying this, but it's all in the book in its way. Nigel also ended up with someone who was, but at least she was a politician, so she understood his life. Nway's other best friend had been even more political in a way than Nway, and had been this great, apparently, like was loved by Aung San Suu Kyi, and he really fell in love with someone who was not a politician. A young girl from a Muslim family who didn't want her to marry a politician, and he ends up marrying and leaving the movement because of student, and regrets it, and has regretted it ever since. I'm still close to him, and he doesn't regret that he's married or that he's a family man, but he regretted that he wasn't able to work, because so at just so many levels people were making sacrifices to be a dissident. Means you couldn't have things that many people in a normal life would expect and want: a good career, a family, children. But those who then had a good career, they were sacrificing because some of them felt like, there's a doctor who I didn't really mention that much in the book, same thing, they want to work for building democracy in their country. They feel as invested in it too, but because they have a family to take care of, they can't. So they sacrifice working for their country, and all of that actually, because all of them, as I'm telling you this, they're all speaking to me through a Buddhist lens in which they feel this stuff so deeply, but they know that there's a trade-off, and so that's one thing. Yeah, just tangibly, the kind of sacrifices people were making day in, day out. Every single character in this book was making some horrific personal sacrifice. The Dr. Z's and the Kinmao Shuis that we mentioned earlier, get straight out of prison. Their wives had sacrificed for them for years, trying to be in touch with them. And they immediately launched back into this incredibly dangerous career where they might be thrown back in prison any day for another 20 years and then die there. And they all, and Kim Al Shui was willing to efface himself for what he believed from the person he really venerated. Aung San Suu Kyi, he loved her so much, and he went off and created his own sort of party and was considered a traitor, which was just, it's like when your own peers reject you, it's so much harder than when your enemy rejects you, as a human being. So they all had this ability to kind of take that in stride. And I think that's what's remarkable. Often we'll watch the sort of classic Hollywood or hero's journey is one brave individual who goes off on their adventure and they learn something. And as I'm telling you this, I'm realizing every single one of the people I'm describing in their own very nuanced, very human way was so much a part of their natural life to sacrifice. And maybe that's a very human thing, but I think it wouldn't even occur to them that they were doing something brave and
Mm.
courageous, and because it's seen through this Buddhist lens. And then the other thing is that I don't know if I've stressed this already, but I will stress this again and again. What I saw from particularly the time Nway and Nigel were in their early 30s, I know that they knew that they had no clue. As I said, I set out this book writing about a twilight movement, and they were dedicated to it on the ground. They had no sense to this day, that they were working for something that might have happened in their lifetime. They knew that they were giving themselves to a
Mhm.
cross generational.
Mhm.
And so that level of sacrifice is what has allowed the Burmese to have this deep, long haul vision of generation after generation. And by the way, prior to this discussion, you and I talked about Generation Wave, this other
Mhm.
underground movement that's briefly mentioned in my book, but they became.
Mhm.
Why would they call themselves generation? Every single little protest movement referred to themselves as a generation. They were doing that because they were basically saying we are within this huge, larger movement way beyond our 10 years, which speaks to that culture of sacrifice. Now, on the other extreme, the other thing you reference, does that get too extreme? I don't know. Yeah, I think insofar as maybe people have been unwilling to really stand up to Aung San Suu Kyi when they should have, because they felt too self-effacing, not
Right.
because they were willing to be submissive, because we are talking about people who were fighting for democracy and really believed it down to their core, like to sacrifice their lives for years fighting for democracy, not for Aung San Suu Kyi. Let's get that clear. Some people outside the NLD might, but these people that I'm writing about, they were all working for democracy. They just happened to love Aung San Suu Kyi as the figurehead. But yeah, could it mean that then when push comes to shove, when some of them should have stood forward and taken that much more egotistical, sort of, they weren't willing to do that. That's where I think it might. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on where you think the limits of that sacrifice, can take you too far.
Yeah, as I'm hearing you talk, I mean, one of the things that I'm thinking is that there's a lack of a clash of ideas, and that a clash of ideas is often there's a lot of fear and anxiety among Burmese I know, and especially when I worked at the American Center as a trainer and would try to navigate critical conversations, that a clash of ideas, especially looked at with who you're talking to, what group they're from, what level they're at, that there can be inherent disrespect by disagreeing, and that one feels such a desire to not want to be in those uncomfortable situations where there's disagreements, that it's avoided altogether. And I would go through a lot of sessions that I ran among the participants where we would really be able, through their own experiences and voices, they were able to demonstrate how you could have a difference of opinion and a clash of ideas while not being disrespectful, that you could have the ultimate respect for the person that you're talking to before, during, and after the encounter. And both of you can grow and learn and actually become closer at a personal level while still having that contrast of ideas. And so I think that that is really what has to be seen going forward, is a greater courage and engagement to be and fearlessness to have a clash of ideas that on one hand isn't being suppressed for this kind of surface level harmony that, people are thinking or talking behind that apparent and superficial harmony for how they really feel, and on the other hand doesn't cross over into enmity and disagreement and disillusion. And this is, I mean, essentially what you're talking about is a civil discourse, and for a country and a society that doesn't have a safe tradition or history of democracy and democratic thinking, that can be a really tall order. You can't just overnight suddenly learn how to feel safe and comfortable and navigate a civil discourse where there's different opinions. And hey, it's not like we're coming from countries that know how to do that all right. I mean, we certainly have a lot of our own problems. But I think that we have a bit more experience in working towards that goal and working around the margins, even where we've failed pretty horribly in some ways, especially in recent years where you've seen some rise of extremist views even in Western countries, and certainly they've never gone away. But I just think that uh, to engage where different parties and people have different opinions and to proceed with that discussion, that's that's something that we haven't seen to the extent that it could be happening. And I think that even where democratic leaders, so-called democratic leaders, took over and NLD, I don't know to what extent they were really fostering a critical and democratic dialogue. I think there were definitely different views on the country and the priorities and a more fair and equitable society and improvements of all kinds and everything like that. But that's those improvements to society are still not exactly describing democratic thought and this clash of ideas. And I think,
I'm going to interrupt you because I hear what you're saying, but actually that's where I will differ with you, because I think when we're talking about sacrifice, that's one thing. You're sacrificing maybe a little bit of your ability to stand forward. But if there's one thing I learned, I keep referring to dissidents, dissidents, dissidents. There's one thing I learned from Nway and Nigel, and all of them, Winton, they saw themselves primarily as teachers. And what were they teaching? They were teaching people to have critical thinking. I heard this constantly. Maybe it was a lot of the kids that were in the American Center. They're like, critical thinking, we need to learn critical thinking, critical thinking, critical thinking, critical thinking. And I'm like, where did they get this buzzword? Because it's the one thing, of course, the great tragedy among the many, many tragedies that Myanmar has suffered was it prided itself on having the most social progress after decolonization of any country in Southeast Asia, if I'm not mistaken. It had a phenomenal education system. That the student union was the first thing to be blown up and destroyed repeatedly by the junta, because universities were these founts of critical thinking. And the young people and the older, the NLD figures I'm writing about, all of them were very independent minded, and they were desperately trying. That was what they were teaching to other people. And Nigel in his classes was kind of almost having a Socratic dialogue in the slums with people that were not accustomed to that. They had been taught to be incurious and timid for all the reasons you said. They were living in a country, as any country that's been through dictatorship and repression, even the country I'm in right now, Mexico, people have not necessarily been taught to think critically, to dare to be like in America or in Western Europe, to sort of stand up and disagree with a teacher and say, that's okay, it's encouraged. So that's one thing about this dissidence. Actually, I found them all to be very, very, very dissenting among themselves. Now, what you're talking about is this really difficult other part, which they all spoke to me about, because they would then try to change the culture within the institutions, working with people that had not been exposed to that way of thinking. And then, of course, doing a better job of translating, once they were into government, of their personal ability. I mean, every single one of the characters we mentioned, I know for a fact they're very capable of having an argument. But did they do that publicly enough? Did we give them enough of a voice? This is what always frustrated me so much about this excess coverage on Aung San Suu Kyi. Like, all you had to do is talk to these other legislators, and you would hear Nigel have this. I wish I could shut up and let him talk, and then he would give a much better answer to all of these things. Or So I think, their job, and they would be the first to say it. And I think I mentioned to you prior to this conversation how Nway of Generation Wave once said to me, freedom is a process. They understood. They were actually, Nway says it in the book. He said
Mhm.
at the end of the book, we're at the beginning of the beginning, or we're at the beginning of the, they understood that they had so much more work to do. They barely had
Yeah.
a chance to go, because it was so dangerous to go out and teach people how to think.
Mhm.
But I would see the stars in the eyes of the young people in the slum who would come to Nigel's class, or who would be talking to Nway late at night, and he would gently introduce to them some real thoughts about sanctions. And for the first time, they'd been allowed to have a dialogue, and a spy wasn't listening, and they could answer. And Nigel and Nway would encourage them to answer. And Win Tin, this is also why people loved Win Tin, because he dared to, like, he would say whatever the hell he wanted to say, and he
Yeah.
wasn't scared, and he wouldn't bite his
Mhm.
tongue, and he was really sharp about it. And another thing that my book completely loses, because I wrote in English, but I studied a bit of Burmese, but very little. But there's so much punning that happens in Burmese, and I said
Mhm.
Win Tin was an extraordinary punner. Like, there's a lot of, and
Mm.
they like, so actually, I think what they, I don't think they failed, because I think history is short. They'd be the first to say history. You've got to read the long story of it. But there was a kind of independent mindedness that this movement understood they needed to convey, and that was what they were working towards. A lot of them, a lot of people that I'm documenting. And if they hadn't quite achieved it, it's because they hadn't quite achieved it yet. And then in government,
Mhm.
yeah, there were so many compromises with the military government that ultimately had the
Yeah.
power, that they maybe shut up too much. And that's where maybe Aung San Suu Kyi evolved too much into being way too conciliatory to the military, and kind of forgot about how she'd been this kind of very outspoken dissident of dissidents to begin with, who spoke about freedom of fear. And that's, the essay I invite everyone to go back to, where she's speaking to this Burmese language about
Mhm.
escaping this
Mhm.
kind of culture of submissiveness. Because it's an internal corruption, I think, is what she say, if I'm not and they, so I don't know if that goes some way to answering. And you certainly saw this on the front lines, because I think the American Center was so essential on this front, and the British embassy as well, and the
It
French,
was,
right?
and what's so interesting about, I think, the years I was at the American Center, and during that period, what was so fascinating about them was not only was it this critical resource for so many Burmese that were coming to make use of how singular it was and what it offered and provided, but it was just a golden period of my memory in my life as well. But what's so interesting is that several years ago, I was in Yangon and had kind of a mini reunion, just coincidentally, of a couple teachers that happened to be in town, a couple of the Burmese staff and librarians that were also there. And as we sat down and talked, well, actually, we were talking to the head librarian that was there, and she'd been there for decades. And she described how the period that we were there. I mean, these aren't set dates. I was there from like 7 to 11 or so, and I'm not sure exactly what year she was describing, but something around that period. But importantly, pre-transition. So this wasn't in any way related to what was happening with transition. But she was just describing how, in her institutional memory of the American Center, something about those years was this magical golden period where everything came together and there wasn't one loose link anywhere, where the different teachers and programs and administrators and people from the embassy and library and everything else, everything was just firing on all cylinders. And that's how it felt. That was my own personal subjective feeling of what it felt like to be there, and also what I heard of the Burmese students and participants that I worked with directly. But it was kind of astounding to me to get that feeling from her, that it wasn't just this really special subjective time I had in my own life, and it wasn't even just that the American Center was this perennial kind of amazing place that always had these great things. I mean, I'm sure, it obviously had programs and was always that resource, but there was something, and the period where you're writing is the period I'm describing. I mean, you're talking post Nargis. I got there 6 months before Nargis. My apartment was destroyed by Nargis, and so that
Wow.
was the
Didn't
period that I was living there. And so you're describing, to kind of bring a more a deeper understanding into your character's experiences with the American Center. According to this librarian who'd been there for years, this was kind of a golden age. This was like a period where, for whatever reason, the kinds of people who came together and the kinds of things they were doing, everything was working, and every program was kind of intersecting with some other program. And all these ideas were flowering and all these new things were taking shape. And so it wasn't just a special place, but it was a really special place at that time, with that assortment of people that made it up, not just of the teaching and training administrative side, also the students that were coming in, and it was just one of those things where, everything came together at the right moment, and it was just like lightning in a bottle for a couple years.
Yeah, I hear you 1000%. I think, maybe two or three other embassies had something similar, but from my experience, from what I understood, it was such a necessary oasis at a time of, and you're saying this because this is also in the context of an incredibly brutally repressive moment when,
Hmm.
people really couldn't gather into it. And I remember the first time I walked into the American Center, and I'm gonna get this wrong. I remember like seeing, this country where I couldn't ask people, oh, what do you think of your government? Like, they'd be immediately thrown in jail, or they'd be terrified or whatever. But, I walk into the American Center and I see this billboard right as you walk in that's saying, can you please get us Fareed Zakaria's book on liberal and illiberal democracy? And like,
Right.
whatever it
Yeah.
is, like a Jefferson's, this, that, and the other. And like,
Yeah.
books that were totally banned, and and it was a free space. Having said that, it was a dangerous space as well. Look at the people I met there. Thanks
Yeah.
to people at the American Center, knew that they had to also be quiet even there because there were spies there. As
Oh,
I
yeah.
understand, the first time I went there, the U.S. Embassy let me meet a couple of dissidents there to interview, and I was writing for the Post. But they said, please, whatever you do, don't mention the American Center. They probably figure it out. But the
Mhm.
last thing you need to do is tell the government that you're meeting people here. And then some other writer, I won't say who, I won't say for what publication, but another writer was there around the same time as me and like described it in great detail. And as I understood a few months later through a common acquaintance you and I have, Joel, that we mentioned, Shui Win, who we should also mention is an incredible, brilliant
Mhm.
Shui Win, who went on to be an amazing journalist, but who I met in that first trip. He's
Mhm.
not a huge character in my book, but boy, is he a brilliant dissident and
Yeah.
soul in his own right, and
Yeah.
just genius. Who learned English reading Tolstoy in prison, like just
Mm.
the translation. And speaks like Tolstoy. But anyway, I know that I think the American Center was raided subsequently, and I remember asking Sherman at the time because I met him in the American Center, I think, the first time or once. I certainly met him there in talk, and I wondered if it wasn't because that article had sort of pointed a special branch to, well, maybe we should go in and like clear out a few
Right.
of these like talky types, and so yeah, the American Center served many purposes, and it was a golden place, and I think people forget that too easily, particularly in America these days, where people forget they're so
Yeah.
they have no idea what freedom of speech is until suddenly they'll lose it, and they'll see what it's like to be in a country where it's so precious, and people there and sure as hell
Mhm.
knew the value of it.
Yeah, and to give some background for listeners who don't know what we're talking about with the American Center, this was part of like a post-Cold War uh, U.S. policy of promoting soft power through. They had these USIS, U.S. Information Service, kind of libraries that would crop up behind the Iron Curtain and would just be able to provide different access to various kinds of literature and other programs that weren't necessarily available in their country. And after the Cold War ended, most of the USIS centers around the world just disappeared. They didn't see much value in them. As I understood it, the one in Yangon was one of like three of however many dozen or even hundred existed at some time that was retained and remained in the country and took on this role of similar to in behind the Iron Curtain in the Cold War of being able to provide access to different kinds of thinkings, different programs, different books, a certain kind of oasis of freedom that wasn't allowed elsewhere. Although, as you said, of course there were spies, of course there were informants, and so that was always present. But you do get a kind of radar and having a sense of when things don't quite seem right and where you're getting questions that feel like they're coming for another reason. And so that is possible to navigate. But you're never just because you pass a U.S. security guard and go into to a place that's operated by the embassy, so veritably on American soil, yeah, there's actually not safety there. But I want to move on as well to something else in your book. You reference Gene Sharp, and of course, Gene Sharp is famous among in the Myanmar democracy movement for the role that he played in encouraging all kinds of nonviolent uh, resistance to military rule and all the forms and shapes that nonviolence can take, and the way that one can employ nonviolent techniques to be able to resist an oppressive regime. And you write quite a bit in the book about how the younger generation that you're cataloging, how important this nonviolent ethos is to being able to take the high road to eventually drive out these cronies and military dictators and generals and everything else. And of course, today it's a very different picture. The revolution has taken on an armed component. I know that as you're now based in Mexico, you haven't been closely following all of the latest developments, but this is a big turn for an age-old democracy movement in Myanmar that is always, I shouldn't say always, of course, there have been armed sectors and parts of the democracy movement, or the anti to say it probably a bit more accurately, the anti-military junta movement, because people sometimes are aspiring for different things, especially when you throw in the ethnics. Certainly there has been an armed component before. It's not like this is a totally new thing, and even during 88 you had some of the students being trained, as now not in as high as numbers in ethnic areas. However, the growth and the extent and the overall acceptance of the necessity of an armed part of this movement is something that really is a dramatic shift from anything we've seen before. And it'd be interesting to know Aung San Suu Kyi's thoughts on it. That many people have wondered that, since she was also many years a supporter of nonviolent resistance. However, many activists who've spent their whole lives and careers in this ethos now openly on the record have come out and said that it won't succeed this way, that it needs to make this jump. So, as far as you've been following it or talking to people in the movement from before, what are your thoughts on this change into an armed part of the movement?
Yeah, it's so fascinating. Again, you raised so many things. I asked this directly of Nway, at which point he
Mhm.
was already in exile, supposedly, giving, helping turn deserters and keep them on the side of the NUG. Sort of accent. We could, in 1962, we said that armed struggle. We can, since 1962, we could say that armed struggle has not succeeded. But since 1962, we can say that nonviolent struggle has not succeeded. That was his answer to me. It was this kind of beautiful balance between, we don't know, we got to do what we got to do. But the thing about the nonviolence, to get to Gene Sharp, and I had the great fortune to speak with Gene Sharp before he passed. He was quite advanced, and Bob Helvey, who had worked with him, this colonel who'd come up with the term non-violent, defiant sort of civil disobedience on the border after 1988. He was teaching students this, and their philosophy. Although Gene Sharp would consider himself more of a synthesizer, where he was just really looking historically at where people had been able to take down a dictator non-violently versus violently. And what they showed was that it wasn't really about having the moral high ground, although inevitably that would come with it in people's lives. Is that the one thing you cannot do with a dictatorship is fight them with brute force, because that's the one thing they have the monopoly on. They have the brute force violence. They try, the students of 1988 tried this for a while. They tried it with bamboo sticks in the jungle, as I understand. Like it was a joke, and they knew that. They were like physics students and literary students, and they had to find another way. And so nonviolence, the idea of the Gene Sharp way and the way of all of these, NLD activists and others, Generation Wave, and all of these other dissident movements that were loosely tied together, they understood that you had to, in Bob Helvey's words to me, sort of show people who were the pillars of support of the government a sort of a viable tomorrow, I think was the words he used to me once. You need to tell the civil servants, if you gently show them that if they retract their help for the junta, they have an alternative. And so slowly you take away the pillars of support, because every dictator since the history of the world, their caprices will be executed on by several different, by acolytes, by a civil service, by military officers, by police, by all the. And what we've seen amazingly, by the way, since the coup, and I wrote one piece on this, but it was exactly this: the extraordinary and very, very, very long civil disobedience movement in Burma was proof of this. It was where you had all the civil servants and everyone, bankers, to, sort of on strike. Again, speaking of sacrifice, huge sacrifice. None of them were making money for months. I mean, what other countries actually done this where you've had like a massive, we're not just talking about students who really don't have that much to lose, who do great things, when they go protest. This is, And that was exactly one of, I think Gene Sharp puts it was like 198 ways of civil disobedience, you know. And one of them is this, that all the pillars of support are shaken, and that as a result, you know, what can a dictatorship do? It can't run the country. It certainly isn't picking up the trash. And then maybe you get like Nway is now doing one of the most critical things in the world, getting that brute force to then collapse. Because if they're all the deserters in the army, gently one by one, getting a viable alternative, they're getting a salary from the alternative government. Whoa, you know, suddenly that government, the junta, no longer has as much power. Now, on the armed struggle element of it, yeah, that's what I've heard too from a lot of people who, you know, previously they were nonviolent, but they weren't doing it as saints. They were doing it because it was the smartest approach, and left with nothing. Or I wouldn't say it was that they were left with nothing, is that they realized that the constitutional compromise that they had agreed to, they can't go back to, number one. And then number two, they've never been able to work effectively because of the previous junta with the different ethnic groups who already had very highly developed armed struggles. And and as I understand, but again, this is through loose reporting, you know, the NUG, they really came together in a way that they'd never been able to before, where you had the NLD, the kind of so-called non-violent movement, coming together with the different ethnic minorities who had armed struggles for however many decades each. And the result of it is, yeah, horrifically a kind of civil war. But you know, I think in the context of it, they can all justify it in that sense, and that maybe this is the way forward. Insofar as they've never been, that was one of the biggest problems which led to the junta in the first place, or military government, I should say, in 1962, was that they'd never been able to reach a proper agreement with the different ethnic minorities around the country, right? So I think it's very complicated, and I would love to explore this more. But yeah, from the main character in my book, who had been like the most seminal non-violent activist I knew, you know, I think he accepts that this has to be the way. They have to have their own civil defense force. Also, they can't stand around and let themselves be massacred. And they're, you know, they were seeing just these horrific crackdowns that were leading
Yeah.
to children getting killed. And at some point, you know, everyone has the right to self-defense unless you're really truly a sort of extreme pacifist.
Yeah, and I think that some of the criticisms that come from more developed countries, I think are somewhat hypocritical and not understanding the difference between how a developed state offers protection in kind of unseen and invisible ways that we all buy into, and what happens when those constructs break down and kind of uh, all those lenses are off, and you're just seeing things really in their gritty human core. In the sense that if I've given this analogy before, but it appeared to me soon after the coup, I was realizing, oh, you know, if there's someone in my neighborhood in the U.S. who is any number of things. Let's say he's breaking into places and stealing things. Let's say he's doing something much worse. He's actually harming people, even raping women, or just doing extremely unsafe behavior. We know that there's a system where that's going to get reported, and the the necessary um, how to say potentially aggressive behavior to subdue this person is going to be a burden that the state takes on. And of course, we see, I'm not to romanticize our police force. There's obviously those legitimate concerns of police violence and brutality, and those are very legitimate. But also there is a violence that is an aggressiveness that is licensed to our police force to be able to subdue those problem people that might be harming us in our communities. And what you saw in Burma after the coup was that this all broke down. And if you had someone in your community, in this case, it was the military that was assaulting and arresting, raping, stealing, even killing, abducting its citizens, you had no one to outsource this to. So this was a burden that you had to take on within your community, and to whether it was decision making, whether it was enacting, whether it was playing some kind of role. And I think that in that context, when you see the rise of the armed part of the movement, you're looking in many ways, this arose from resistance forces of communities, that communities were seeing how different provocateurs and troublemakers were coming in to harm their citizenry, where there is no way to outsource this to any other entity. There is no way to have any kind of civil discourse or let even an uncivil discourse and being able to use words alone to be able to prevent this. There was no outside support of any kind coming in. And so everything, the usual constructs of society were torn away. And all you had left was the gritty reality of like a Wild West town of, if we want justice, if we want protection, we're going to have to bear this burden ourselves. And that's not a description to justify the overall work of the armed part of the movement now, or to try to give a defense of it, because as you said, it's a very complicated issue. But I think that if you're trying to understand where this armed part came from and you don't have that perspective in mind, then something is missing. I mean, you're really out of it. You're looking at things in kind of a fabricated, hypocritical, developed lens that is really not accurate to what they're doing and how they're doing it. And I've spoken to many Western activists as well, who are lifetime peace activists and, Buddhists and meditators and everything else. And anyone who has been engaging to any real degree in Myanmar in terms of understanding what's happening, they've all said that they're questioning long held, lifelong beliefs of the different ways that you bring these things to bear in a society, anything from, gun ownership to the role of violence, or anything else. And so, and again, this is not to give some kind of justification or defense, but just to put out there how complicated and nuanced the situation is, and to what degree we have to be willing to look critically at those parts of our own society that are invisible to us, and that we're privileged by. We're privileged to be able to say that, well, I live according to strict nonviolent attitudes in my own society, where if there's an intruder causing us harm, our values are not going to be put to the test, because we have an authority who's going to take care of that. And maybe they'll overstep their bounds, and maybe that will come to light or not. So I don't want to paint too much of a rosy picture on it, but it is outsourced. I mean, to some degree, it is outsourced. And if you're not recognizing that privilege and freedom in where we're living, then you're not really understanding the decision-making process they had to go through there.
Yeah, yes, 1000%. I think it's that speaks to sort of, it's very easy to take the moral high ground when there's a very famous anecdote about Gandhi, the great pacifist, who Orwell wrote a wonderful essay about it, where he mentions this anecdote. I don't know if it's true, but Gandhi supposedly in an interview, because I've not tracked down the interview, gave an interview in which he famously said that, all the Jews should have committed suicide during World
Yeah.
War II. And I think Orwell or someone, other people criticize Gandhi because they're like, well, it's all very well, you could be pacifist because, yeah, the British did terrible things under colonialism, but, the worst, I think there was one massacre and the guy was held to account. Like, the point is, when you're working with a government that respects the rule of law, by which I mean not rule, law and order a la dictatorship, but rule of law, which everyone is equal before the law. And as you just beautifully said, there's accountability in America that we've outsourced to organizations that work for the public interest. And the few bad apples, of which there are always going to be bad apples, are held to account. And famously so in the last 3 years in America, to a degree that I think has distorted the picture of I trust the police in America. I trust. Whereas I have been to many countries, the countries I currently cover, where no one trusts the police, for better or for worse. Because you don't. The police are scared. Men in uniform are scared. And so when you talk, that was always the case in Burma until suddenly this opening and people tried to abide by the. And there, Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD towed this kind of very delicate line where they had to work with the military and sort of develop this kind of trust again. And then we've gone back to exactly this, where you've had this situation where it seems that this junta absolutely sees the citizens of its own country as the enemy, and therefore will mow them down, as famously happened in which dictator was a treason in 1988 who said that I'm going to mow you all down. I remember Nway telling me this at one point, and I have it here, where this is a chapter called City of Exiles, where he and Nigel are in flashback going over to Mesa to get a little bit of training and come back. And so they're going through the ethnic hinterlands, and they're both Burman from the non-violent NLD struggle and never had a chance to, and so this is Nway thinking, basically. No activist from the mainland pro-democracy movement deluded himself that he or she had it worse. In their struggle, they had opted for non-violence. But never had they reproached the ethnic minorities, the Karen, the Kachin, the Shin, the Shan, the Mon, the Arakan, Karenni, or Wa, to name the largest group, for resorting to arms when soldiers were coming to burn down your village, or rape your sister, or turn your father into a live landmine buffer on a forced march. You couldn't exactly fall to your knees in prayer and expect sudden pangs of conscience to stay your attackers. Sorry, I'm quoting myself there. But, like that's, they knew that. In other words, again, it wasn't about, they kind of had the luxury of being able to be non-violent, even if they risked a lot, but they would be the first to say, even the ones that spent 19 years in solitary confinement, oh, but we had it better than the ethnic people who were getting beaten up and killed down the corridor. I would hear this repeatedly. So I think now, yeah. Oh, and then the other thing I would say, and again, I'm being very long-winded, what's remarkable, but I'm only seeing this from afar, is that when I was first reporting, even from afar, on how this alternative government, the NUG, was coming together, they immediately formed a defense force. Like, they're forming, like, a government, what's the first thing it has to do is protect its citizens, form an army. That legitimizes force in the name of self-protection, right? As opposed to allowing this anarchic, which they were seeing, and for all the reasons you described, these self-defense groups, but then who's coordinating and who's stopping all the crimes that they can commit in the name of protecting their civilians and doing horrific things to any poor soldier that they get hold of. So in a way, what was remarkable, what's happened post-coup, as I understood it, talking to some of the people who became part of that, and the very fact that they had been activists, you mentioned this earlier and I didn't address it, that they had been in prison, they lived through all of that. They knew what the stakes were. And then here they are back in it, but using different tactics to ultimately achieve the same goal.
I think it was also just that the gloves were off, and that if there's,
Yeah.
going back to the example I gave, if there's an intruder in my area, if I see someone suspicious that is definitely is acting in a way around my neighborhood that makes it look like there's behavior that's indicating he's up to something, I am going to call the police to alert them, and then I'm gonna kind of not think about it. I mean, I'll still look out to see what's happening and see if there's anything, any updates, but I'm not really going to think about what the police do and how this is going to affect the life of the intruder, and what bad results are going to happen. It's really out of mind. It's now on them. But you don't have that police force, or rather, in Myanmar, you have a police force which is actually in charge of terrorizing you. They're the ones that are looting, abducting, raping, killing, etc. And any decision that you make, the blood is on your hands. I mean, that was the thing that really shocked me after the coup. And I was talking to friends and realizing the kind of decisions they were making in their community. If you have this intruder lurking around who's up to no good, he's up to no good. And your loved ones and your community is at risk. If you're going to do something to subdue that intruder, the blood is on your hands. And because there's no, the veneer is gone in terms of what the constructs of society are doing for you. And so, if in that situation, for you to say, well, I'm nonviolent, this is not something that, because of my principles, I'm just going to let be. Well, actually, what that's doing, that kind of privileged attitude, is meaning that other people are going to do the action, which is going to put them in danger, in harm's way, is also going to be the thing that's going to give them nightmares, and that they're going to have to live with, in terms of the literal blood on their hands. And you're going to benefit from the safety of no longer having that intruder. So you holding that value is actually very hypocritical, because you're going to benefit by the what the other people do to keep that community safe. And because you don't sign off on it, that's not going to have to go on your conscience, but you're still going to benefit it, unless you're just of such a noble stock that you're really following that Gandhian principle, and you're literally allowing yourself to be killed by marauding soldiers that are coming. Okay, maybe you can claim that ethic. But if instead you're going to benefit by those that are doing the dirty business, while also uh, uh, being able to claim that this is not your own ethic or value, then this is a very skewed way to look at it. And this was as things took shape after the coup, and I was realizing the kinds of decisions that people were faced with there, and I began to realize that, it just floored me. And anyone, the other kind of foreign allies that were engaged in some way, were going through similar things. I mean, everyone I knew that was really involved was going through these same kind of ethical decisions, where if you were really honest with yourself and you were seeing the what they were up against and how they had to make their decisions, you were just seeing, well, this is the being able to claim some values in the West. It doesn't work there. And if we and again, this is not to defend or justify one approach or another. It's just to say that if you're not understanding the actual nuance of the situation, you're not in really a place to give judgment. And then you come to, like, the worst of all possible analyses, which is the both sides argument. Both sides need to stop doing things that are going to incite violence. Both sides need to, et cetera, et cetera. And that's really a grave misunderstanding to go to that place, and really shows, I think, quite a bit of ignorance about what's actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. I hear you on everything that you said, and yes, I think it. Ultimately, I think the right to life is probably the most important right of all. Otherwise, you can't really enjoy any other right. And if your government is unable or unwilling to protect your right to life, i.e., you are the enemy, and they will shoot you or as you say, there's an intruder that comes in and there's no security force. What are you supposed to do? And it's funny that the people that would be critical of this are also sort of, probably quite happy to watch a movie about, Batman or vigilante justice. Why do we like vigilante justice so much? And by the way, in the countries which I'm reporting on now, where there's like no rule of law, the polls have found that, desire to take justice into one's own hands has gone up from 40% to 60% in 10 years. Why? Because the security forces are perceived to be not working for you. Because and we all kind of secretly like cheer when the Lone Ranger or whatever, the Batman goes and like punches the villain because no one else will. And I know that's a silly analogy, but yeah, I think there's everything that you said. I think is very true, and it's hard to gauge though. Having said that, I mean, I haven't been there, and I have no idea of the extent to which the country has either descended into anarchy or into civil war, and it's obviously a very, very messy, difficult, bloody, really tragic situation. Although tragedy seems to take out the human agency element of it. But yeah, it's certainly a little bit more complex than as simple as just saying, oh well, we'll just all collectively sit down. As during the Saffron Revolution, we all sit down and pray and hope they won't mow us down. If they do, the whole world will be outraged and something will happen. Now it's way beyond that.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So we were talking a bit before the interview about this, and you've also referenced this several times in this conversation, just sharing how you tend to take the long view of Myanmar, looking at each of the prior movements as one step in a long process that moves towards democracy. And I should say, this isn't so much you taking this view, because from your work there, you're taking in the view of all of those on the forefront of the movement, the grassroots. So really, this is representing their view. You're giving life and voice to their view of this kind of long process. And you also mentioned how, being French, that people have insisted to you that the French Revolution is really an example of how revolutions aren't ultimately effective because it ends with the terror. But your response to that is that ultimately it did bring democracy. It just took another 100 years to do so. And so, with this in mind, on this long march to democracy in Burma, where would you say we're at now with the coup and the ongoing resistance movement in this aspiration?
Wow. Well, I think, from the little bits I've been even able to report from afar, they're still on track. I mean, it's taking this horrible, it would seem 10 steps backward for every step forward. But there's no way they're ever going. The very fact that we've seen this massive, first of all, that massive and incredible civil disobedience movement, which I don't know if people have forgotten, but I don't even know if it's still going on, but for months, way beyond the early protests that got a lot of attention, people were on strike and refusing to take salaries, and at huge personal sacrifice as a massive movement trying to shake this junta so it couldn't operate. Clearly, things have descended into something much more more of an armed struggle now. But what seems very evident to me is that this is a nationwide response. I mean, you had a sort of huge response, millions of people in 1988. This is way beyond that. First of all, all the people in my book who are still alive and who I've been able to talk to, the first thing they'll do is point to the young people who stood forward initially after this coup. But I will respond to them that, those young people, brave though they were, like, were able to grow up in 10 years of relative freedom thanks to the people that came before, number one. So they're never going to go back to that repression. But all of them have tasted by now something beyond where they had been when I first went, 2008, or when you first went, Joe, or people before us. They have tasted enough of what a bit of freedom feels like that they will never accept to go back to what this junta is now offering. Mm-hmm. And that is huge. Now, how they get there, I don't know. I think the history is being written as we talk, and it's messy, and it's, what's that line from Augustine? God writes straight with crooked lines, or the arc of progress bends towards justice. I sort of believe that. I'm a bit of an optimist, but I think along the way, there's a lot of. I think they're en route. And maybe this is, I think some of them. I'm going to misquote his name. Someone who was with the NUG had said to me, that now they won't go back to that constitution. Although for a while they were, it was conceived of as this kind of clear transition out of authoritarianism towards democracy. It wasn't that way for a lot of dissidents. They understood they were in this kind of messy compromise. Well, maybe that didn't work. So they rip out that page now. Now they're not going to have a compromise in the military. This is a very, very bloody, nasty way to get there. But maybe they're going to get there some other way. And meanwhile, amazingly, they, from what I can tell from afar at least, they've developed a unity with the ethnic groups that they had not been able to achieve before, and they had thrown them to the side so they could have a compromise in the military that turned out to not work. So I don't know. It feels like, in a very, from the 30,000 foot perspective, in the long, long story of Burma, they haven't exactly sat pretty and said, oh, fine, take over, forget this. The whole democracy movement, quite the contrary, to a degree that's pretty amazing. And actually, really, I think if one goes back and looked, and I did try to document this in one piece I wrote after the coup, the speed with which they organized into an alternative government, and not just a sort of symbolic alternative such as they had in the past that ended up in Maryland and was just an acronym. They really have tried to organize. And why were they able to do that? Because they already knew what it took to do that. And no, they haven't got to destination. How could they? We're talking about, fighting an army with all the military, benefits that they have, but they're getting there eventually. So I still have huge faith in them. And I think because of all the things we spoke about, the sacrifice and the understanding of that long struggle and all the other things that many of them have, and even the Buddhist philosophy underlying all this, they're going to get there. It just might not be in their own lifetimes. And some of them are willing to accept that. But they're going to fight like hell until they get there and lose a lot of people along the way. And they know that.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for taking the time to talk about your book and its relevance to the current movement. Again, the book's name is Rebel of Rangoon, for those listeners that are inspired to go read that now.
Published clandestinely in Burma by a clandestine publisher, and was, I understand, selling quite well before the coup because it featured people who were going on. And I'm not saying that because of the book, but because I think people have reached out to me from Kachin territory and, Burmese, or people who are fighting in the struggle, and have said that they've been reading it because, not because because all it does is manage to capture a little bit of what they're doing now. And I think it's very easy for those of us who aren't there, or even some, to not see the wood from the trees. And there is something going on there that is persisting, and we might not see the visible signs of it for a long time to come. We might only hear of this terrible massacre, this many people died, or this little thing happened, this press release, this ASEAN figure goes to talk to that person. But something is going on there, and it's real, and people are willing to die for it. And we kind of maybe already said this, but I would invite listeners, I'm sure they're a broad audience, to not give up on Myanmar or the people who are fighting for democracy, because I know that they're out there, and I know that they're not going to come forward and tell you who they are unless you really look for them. But they're working day in, day out. I have 100% certainty of this still going on.
We'd like to take this time to thank our generous supporters who have already given. We simply could not continue to provide you with this content and information without the wonderful support of generous donors, listeners, and friends like you. Each episode helps in providing access to one more voice, one more perspective, one more insight. Every donation of any size is greatly appreciated and helps us continue this mission. We greatly appreciate your generosity, which allows us to maintain this platform. Thank you. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam